Welcome again tonight for another journey into the quiet and shadowed corners of history. Tonight, we will wander into the depths of a swamp so dark and so heavy with sorrow that it became the resting place of a prison built not for redemption, not for justice, but for despair itself, a place from which no one returned alive, where walls of stone and waters of decay worked together to erase every trace of those who entered. So now, dim your lights, close your eyes, let the sounds around you soften into quiet, and allow the steady rhythm of words to carry you far away, into a story told not with haste, but with calm patience, where every detail unfolds like a slow tide, and where the weight of the past settles gently, lulling you toward sleep. The swamp stretched endlessly, or at least it felt that way to anyone who dared to look upon it, a place where the land itself seemed to give up the idea of being firm and dry, where every step was uncertain, sinking just enough to remind the traveler that the ground was not trustworthy, that beneath the green slime and thick reeds there was only water and mud waiting to claim whatever pressed too hard upon it, and the air, thick and foul, clung to the skin like a damp cloth that would never dry, carrying with it the odor of decay, of plants that had drowned before they could grow, of animals that had died and never fully decomposed, leaving their memory in the stench that never faded, even when the wind stirred. The stillness of the swamp was never truly silent, for there was always a buzzing, the constant drone of insects that rose and fell like an endless chant, joined at times by the slow croak of frogs hidden in the reeds or the distant splash of something unseen slipping into the water. But despite these sounds, the swamp remained a place of suffocating quiet, where no birds sang freely, and no wind seemed strong enough to shake the tangled trees whose roots twisted in and out of the water as though they, too, were struggling to escape. The color of the swamp was neither green nor brown nor black, but some mixture of all three, a shifting palette of rotting moss, stagnant pools, and waterlogged trunks, so that the eye could not rest upon anything pure or clean, and when the sun did manage to pierce the heavy mist, its light did not brighten the place, but rather made it worse, illuminating the oily sheen that floated on the water's surface, the pale bones of some creature half hidden in the mud, or the faint trails of bubbles that hinted at decay just beneath. In such a place, even breathing felt like a burden, for the air was heavy with moisture, thick enough that it clung to the lungs, and with every inhalation, one felt as though some part of the swamp itself was being drawn inside, making it impossible to forget that this was not a place for life, but rather a place where life slowly drowned. Those who had the misfortune of being led into this swamp spoke later, if they lived long enough to speak, of how the world outside seemed to disappear the moment they entered, as though the swamp existed in another realm, cut off from the sky, the sun, and the seasons, where time moved differently, slower, heavier, each hour stretching into eternity, each day indistinguishable from the last. The mist, always present, wrapped around everything like a shroud, sometimes so dense that one could not see a few paces ahead, and in that endless gray veil, even the shapes of trees and reeds became monstrous, strange figures looming and shifting, making it easy to believe that one was surrounded by spirits, by shadows of the dead who had sunk into the water and never returned. It was here, in this land that seemed designed to reject comfort, that the prison had been built, though before we reach its walls, it is worth lingering upon the swamp itself, for the swamp was not merely the setting but a part of the prison, as much a jailer as the guards who patrolled its walls. The swamp kept men inside just as effectively as chains and iron bars, for who would dare to run into such endless waterlogged despair, knowing that even the healthiest, the strongest, would soon be brought to their knees by fever, by hunger, or by the simple exhaustion of dragging one's body through mud that pulled like quicksand. The swamp punished escape not with swift death, which might have been mercy, but with slow drowning, with the terror of being lost in mist until hunger gnawed and insects feasted, until the body could no longer fight, and the waters claimed another victim to be hidden beneath their murky surface. Every description of the swamp returned again and again to its hostility, yet there was also something strangely compelling about it, a beauty of decay that could mesmerize, for when the moon rose above the mist and the water reflected its pale glow, the swamp became a place of silver ghosts, its still pools glimmering faintly, its trees standing like ancient watchmen, and in those moments, one could almost imagine that this was not simply a place of death, but a realm where the living world met. Something older, something beyond. And perhaps this was why it had been chosen, for those who ordered the building of the prison knew well that no one would willingly come here, no one would dare to wander close unless forced, and so the swamp became not only a boundary but a warning, a reminder to all who lived beyond its edges that within lay a world where hope itself could not survive. Travelers who skirted the swamp on their journeys told of the way the air seemed to change as they approached, growing thicker, heavier, and filled with an unnatural stillness, so that even the most talkative fell quiet, and footsteps slowed, as though some unseen hand pressed down upon them, urging them to turn back before it was too late. They said the swamp had a way of swallowing sound, that a shout would vanish before it reached far, that laughter turned hollow, that even the voice of a companion standing nearby seemed muted, as though the swamp disliked such intrusion. Some claimed that the swamp itself was alive, that it listened, that it remembered, and that it whispered at night in a language no man could understand, a language carried in the rustle of reeds, in the bubbling of water, in the sighing of mist. It is important to understand the swamp in such detail because without it, the prison cannot be imagined, for the prison did not stand against the swamp, but with it, built deliberately to use the swamp's cruelty as its own weapon, and so when one thinks of the prison, one must first see the swamp in all its endless, suffocating misery. Imagine, then, the first time a prisoner was led toward it, stumbling already from chains and exhaustion, the swamp opening before him like a great maw, and in that moment, the man must have known that whatever walls lay ahead, whatever guards, whatever punishments awaited, it was this place itself, the land, the air, the water, that would break him long before iron or whip could do their work. And so, as the swamp stretched onward, with its endless mud and mist, the path wound deeper, until at last the prisoner's eyes would lift and, through the gray curtain of fog, a shape would begin to form, dark and heavy, something built not of reeds or mud but of stone, black and dripping, rising where no human structure ought to rise, and it was then that he would see for the first time the silhouette of the prison itself, standing not as a refuge from the swamp, but as its cruel heart, waiting to swallow him whole. The first sight of the prison rising from the swamp would have been enough to strike fear into even the bravest soul, for it stood not as a creation of men meant to endure time with pride, nor as a fortress raised to defend a city with honor, but rather as a thing built deliberately to disappear into the mist, to blend with the mud and the rot, a fortress not of grandeur but of cruelty, designed to be forgotten by the outside world, so that the men who entered it would fade as quickly from memory as they would from life. The origins of this place were whispered about in taverns and around hearths, though few dared to speak too openly, for to talk of the prison was to invite its shadow into one's own home, and no one wished to be associated with such a thing. Still, pieces of the story survived, carried on the tongues of travelers and officials who had seen too much, and in those fragments one begins to understand how such a place came to be. The decision to build the prison, so the stories said, had not been taken in haste, nor had it been born merely out of necessity, for there were already prisons enough in the towns and cities, walls enough to hold thieves, murderers, and debtors alike. But there were always those for whom an ordinary prison was not enough, men and women whose existence was considered too dangerous to allow them the chance of escape, too shameful to let them be seen by others, or too politically inconvenient to permit their names to be spoken again. For such people, ordinary justice would not do, for ordinary justice still carried with it the faint promise of trial, of appeal, even of eventual release. What was required, instead, was a place outside the reach of law, a place that was not recorded in official ledgers, where sentences were never written down, and where those sent within could be erased as though they had never lived. It was in this way that the swamp was chosen, not because it offered fertile ground, nor because it had any strategic value, but precisely because it offered nothing at all. The swamp was useless for farming, too treacherous for travel, too foul for settlement. In its emptiness, in its hostility, those in power saw opportunity. They saw a place where men could vanish, where chains would not be the only jailer, where the land itself would finish the work of imprisonment without the need for constant watch. It is said that the first stones of the prison were laid not by hired masons, but by prisoners themselves, men brought from distant cells, marched through the mud, and forced to raise the very walls that would become their tomb. Few survived the labor, for the swamp sapped strength more quickly than any whip, and those who died in the mud were left where they fell, their bodies sinking into the water, their bones swallowed by the mire, until even their comrades could no longer find the place where they had collapsed. The rulers who ordered the construction had no need to advertise their project, for secrecy was its very purpose. There were no grand ceremonies of foundation, no proclamations to the people, only the quiet passing of orders from one hand to another, from commander to soldier, from warden to guard. The prison rose in silence, hidden by the swamp, its stones blackened by constant dampness, its walls made thick not to withstand siege, but to crush the spirit of those inside. Some said the builders mixed ash into the mortar, others whispered that the lime was made from the bones of those who had already died in the swamp, but whatever the truth, the result was a fortress that seemed less like something constructed than something that had grown naturally out of the rot and decay around it, a parasite feeding on the swamp, an extension of its hunger. The purpose of the prison, once it was complete, became quickly known among those who ruled, though the common folk were left only to speculate. It was not merely a place for thieves or killers, though many such men ended there, but also for dissidents, for rivals, for those who had spoken words displeasing to the powerful, and even for unlucky souls who had been caught in the wrong company. The prison became a tool of erasure, a way to rid the world of inconvenient names. A man could be seized in the night, dragged through the streets, marched into the swamp, and once he passed beyond those black gates, he was gone, his family told nothing, his fate recorded nowhere. The swamp prison was not a place of sentences, but of disappearances, not a place of time served, but of time ended. Legends grew around its origin, some claiming that a ruler had built it after being betrayed by his closest advisers, determined to have a place where no traitor could ever again escape punishment, others whispering that it was the creation of a council that feared rebellion, a means of silencing voices before they could gather strength. Whatever the truth, all the stories agreed on one point. The prison had never been intended to reform or even to punish in the traditional sense, but only to destroy, to erase, to ensure that those sent within would not return to trouble the living world. In this, it differed from all other prisons, for most prisons still allowed a man to cling to the idea, however faint, that he might one day be free. Here, freedom was not even a dream. The swamp prison's origins also carried with them a sense of the uncanny, for there were those who believed that to build in such a place was to invite the wrath of the land itself. Old tales told of spirits dwelling in the waters, of the dead whose bones lay in the mud whispering curses against those who disturbed them, and some said that it was this curse that gave the prison its reputation of inescapability, that no matter how clever a man might be, no matter how determined, he would always be led astray by the swamp, turned back upon himself until exhaustion claimed him. The builders themselves, so the story went, had seen strange lights in the mist, had heard voices calling in the night, and more than once a man had vanished into the fog, never to be seen again, his tools left behind, his footprints ending abruptly at the edge of a pool. Whether these tales were true or not hardly mattered, for they became part of the prison's legend, woven into its foundation as tightly as stone and mortar, ensuring that even those who had never seen it in person felt a chill when they heard its name spoken. By the time the prison was finished, it was already more than a building. It was a symbol, a warning, a shadow that stretched across the land. No one spoke of it openly in the marketplace, no one wrote of it in letters, but everyone knew that it existed, and that to cross the wrong man, to speak the wrong word, to look the wrong way, might mean being led there. The swamp prison had no official records, no list of inmates, no registers of deaths, but its silence was louder than any proclamation, for silence meant finality. Silence meant that the one taken had been unmade, and in that silence entire families grieved without graves, entire villages whispered prayers without names. And so, the prison stood, heavy and black, its origins already half forgotten, its purpose clear, a place that was not meant to be spoken of yet could not be forgotten, a fortress that seemed less built than conjured, rising from the swamp not to guard against enemies, but to ensure that those inside were never counted among the living again. And when the first chains rattled through its gates, when the first prisoners stumbled through the mist and saw its silhouette before them, they would know, even without words, that they were entering a place designed not to hold life, but to erase it, and that the journey to the prison was already the beginning of their end. The journey to the prison was itself a punishment, a slow erasure that began long before a man reached the gates, for the moment chains were fastened to his wrists and the order was given to march, he was already being led into another world, a place where the ground itself conspired against him and where each step carried him farther from the memory of freedom. Those who were taken from towns or villages rarely had any warning, for the arrests were almost always carried out at night, when the streets were empty, when shutters were closed and doors bolted, so that no witness would ever recall the sight of neighbors being dragged away, stumbling in their night clothes, barely given time to gather themselves before the long walk began. They were herded like cattle, tied together with ropes or iron cuffs, the faint torchlight of the guards throwing shadows across their faces, and though their voices sometimes rose in pleas or protests, the night swallowed them quickly, muffling all cries as though the world itself had already turned its back. The march did not begin with the swamp, but rather with the roads leading toward it, and yet even these were made unbearable by the knowledge of what lay ahead. At first, the terrain was familiar: stone streets, cobbled paths, narrow lanes bordered by fields, but the prisoners had little chance to dwell upon these last glimpses of the living world, for the guards pushed them forward relentlessly, striking with rods or the flat of their blades whenever a man faltered. The first hours were filled with fear, but fear that still held the echo of hope, for some still believed that perhaps they were being taken to an ordinary prison, a cell of stone in the city, a place where others had gone before and even, in rare cases, returned. But as the roads turned to dirt, and then to mud, and as the signs of habitation thinned until only the occasional cottage or lonely tree marked the way, that faint hope began to wither, replaced by the growing dread of what waited where the land gave way to water. The air grew heavier the closer they came, clinging to the lungs until each breath felt like a labor, and with it came the insects, swarming thickly around the chained men, drawn to the sweat that soaked their ragged clothes, to the small wounds left by rope and iron, to the very heat of their bodies. They slapped at them helplessly, but their hands were bound, and so they could do little but endure the endless stinging bites, each one leaving behind a mark that would swell, itch, and fester in the days to come. The sound of the swarm was a constant buzzing, a drone that seemed to bore into the skull, joining with the creak of chains, the shuffle of weary feet, the occasional barked command of a guard, until the march became less a journey than a rhythm, a monotonous procession into despair. Those who stumbled were dragged along by the ropes, their knees scraping the dirt, their mouths filling with dust, until the guards grew tired of the delay and hauled them upright with cruel yanks, striking them across the shoulders until they found the strength to stand. Water was rarely offered, and when it was, it came not in cups but from stagnant pools by the roadside, scooped into the hands of prisoners who had no choice but to drink deeply, ignoring the filth, ignoring the insects floating on the surface, for thirst was a harsher torment than disgust. Food was little better, crusts of bread already moldy, tossed carelessly into the dirt for men to scramble after like dogs, and each time the prisoners bent to pick them up, the guards laughed, for the march was as much about breaking dignity as about reaching the destination. As the procession drew closer to the swamp, the very landscape began to change, the trees growing twisted, their roots rising like claws from the earth, the air thickening with mist even beneath the sun, until the horizon itself seemed to vanish into a pale blur. The ground became softer, sucking at the prisoners' feet, pulling their shoes from them, coating their legs in filth until it seemed they had already begun to sink into the mire, even before the prison appeared. At night they were chained together in the open, forced to sleep on the damp ground, their bodies pressed against mud and roots, the insects feasting without pause, and though exhaustion might have dragged them into uneasy slumber, their rest was haunted by the constant croaking of frogs, the splash of unseen creatures in the water, the rustling of reeds as though someone, or something, moved among them. The guards gave little comfort, for they did not build fires, perhaps out of fear of drawing attention, or perhaps simply out of cruelty, and so the prisoners shivered in the darkness, huddled together for warmth, listening to the swamp's whispers. Some said that it was in these nights before the prison itself appeared that the men truly began to break, for the swamp had a way of seeping into the mind, of making one feel small and lost, abandoned in a place that had no end and no mercy. By the time the march resumed at dawn, shoulders ached, legs throbbed, mouths were dry, and eyes hollow, and yet still they were driven forward, deeper into the mist, farther from anything resembling home. Those who had made the journey before, guards, wardens, soldiers, knew how to read the swamp's signs, but for the prisoners it was all confusion, every path alike, every patch of reeds indistinguishable from the last. More than one man, stumbling at the rear of the line, whispered that he could no longer tell whether they were moving forward at all, or whether they had been circling in place for days, the swamp leading them in endless loops, mocking their weakness. But eventually, after hours that felt like years, there would come a change, subtle at first, in the way the ground rose slightly, in the faint echo of stone beneath boots instead of mud, in the sudden silence of insects that seemed to sense something unnatural nearby. And then, through the mist, shapes would appear, dark lines at first, then towers, then walls, until the entire fortress loomed before them, black and dripping, its silhouette blurred by fog but unmistakably massive, a weight upon the horizon. The first sight of the prison was often the last moment when any thought of resistance flickered, for whatever will remained in the prisoners seemed to drain away the instant they laid eyes upon it. Here was not a building that welcomed the weary, nor a structure that promised justice. Here was a fortress that seemed to lean forward, as though it were watching, waiting, eager to devour those approaching. The swamp might have broken their strength, but the sight of those walls broke their hope, and in that breaking, the journey ended, not with relief that the march was over, but with the sickening knowledge that the true suffering was only about to begin. The fortress revealed itself gradually, as though it were not a structure built by human hands, but a creature rising from slumber, unwilling to be seen all at once, preferring instead to emerge piece by piece through the veil of mist that clung stubbornly to the swamp. At first, there was only the suggestion of lines, the faint outline of something vertical, shapes that could easily have been tricks of the fog. But as the prisoners' weary feet dragged closer, the forms grew sharper, towers taking shape against the pale sky, walls stretching outward into the haze, until at last there could be no mistake, for this was no illusion but a fortress, massive and heavy, built to last not as a monument of pride, but as a weight of despair. The prisoners, broken from the long march, lifted their eyes reluctantly, for the chains around their necks and wrists were heavy, and their shoulders ached, yet still they looked, drawn by a mix of fear and hopeless curiosity, and when they saw what awaited them, whatever strength remained seemed to ebb from their bodies like water from a cracked vessel. The fortress had not been constructed to inspire admiration, nor to declare power in the manner of castles that crowned hills and guarded cities, its towers gleaming in sunlight, its banners waving in the wind. No, this place was built deliberately to look as though it had grown out of the swamp itself, its stones slick with moss and mildew, its surfaces darkened by constant dampness, so that the walls seemed not merely to stand upon the mire, but to be part of it, rising like jagged teeth from a mouth of mud. The walls were high but not elegant, thick slabs of stone set one upon another with more force than care, and though time had already worn grooves across their surfaces, the fortress looked no weaker for it, as though it drew its endurance not from the craftsmanship of men, but from the will of the swamp that surrounded it. The towers were narrow and squat, without ornament, without grace, each one capped with jagged battlements that did not shine with banners or gleam with polished stone, but instead leaned outward like claws, their silhouettes ragged and uneven against the mist. Windows were few, and those that did exist were little more than slits, narrow openings that allowed no light in and no gaze out, so that the fortress appeared blind, watching not with eyes, but with a presence that could be felt in the heaviness of the air, in the way sound seemed to vanish when it reached the walls. The gates, when they first came into view, stood like the jaws of some ancient beast, their iron bars streaked with rust, but no weaker for it, their hinges thick and swollen with age, promising to grind closed with a sound that would echo in the mind long after the ears had forgotten. For the prisoners, the sight of this place was not simply intimidating, it was crushing, for they understood in an instant that whatever chance of escape their imagination had clung to during the march was gone now, swallowed by the enormity of what loomed before them. Some lowered their heads immediately, unwilling to look any longer, while others stared in wide-eyed terror, unable to tear their gaze away, as though hypnotized by the fortress's grim power. A few, in the last sparks of their rebellion, spat upon the ground, muttered curses under their breath. But even these gestures rang hollow, for what defiance could survive in the shadow of such a place? The swamp had broken their bodies, but the sight of the prison broke their spirit, and when both were broken, there was nothing left to stand upon. The guards, who had made this journey countless times before, knew the effect well, and they let the prisoners linger in the shadow of the walls for longer than necessary, standing just beyond the gates, waiting, silent, watching the terror deepen in the faces of those they brought. It was a cruelty repeated with each new arrival, the guards finding grim satisfaction in allowing the prisoners to understand exactly where they were, to feel the weight of the prison pressing down upon them before they even crossed its threshold. The swamp prison did not need speeches or warnings, for the walls themselves spoke, their silence louder than words, telling every soul who looked upon them that there would be no return, no escape, no future beyond the gates. Even the air seemed different here, heavier still, thick with the odor of mildew and rot, yet tinged with something else, something metallic, like iron left too long in the rain. The smell clung to the nostrils, settling on the tongue, making every breath taste of rust, and though the prisoners could not name it, they knew instinctively what it was, for iron was not the only thing that stained these walls. In the silence, broken only by the faint dripping of water from moss and stone, it was easy to imagine the cries that had once filled this place, the rattling of chains, the thud of bodies against stone, the endless moans of despair, all now absorbed into the walls, held there like secrets never meant to be spoken aloud. Some prisoners tried to study the walls, searching for weakness, for cracks, for any sign that this fortress was not invincible, but what they found only deepened their despair, for the swamp had worked with the prison, not against it. The waters rose around its foundations, forming natural moats filled with reeds and slime, the ground immediately beyond the walls sinking into muck that could swallow a man whole. To run was to drown, to climb was to fall, and to push against the gates was to meet iron thicker than any blade could pierce. In this way, the swamp and the prison were one, bound together in cruelty, each ensuring that the other's strength could never be challenged. There was, however, a strange kind of beauty in the first sight of the fortress, though it was a beauty of dread, the same way that a thunderstorm rolling over the horizon holds a kind of majesty even as it threatens destruction. The prison stood with the weight of inevitability, as though it had always been there and would always remain, and in that timelessness some prisoners felt their courage collapse entirely, for what chance did they, mere men, have against something that seemed as eternal as stone and swamp? Their lives, their struggles, their memories, all seemed small and fleeting in comparison, soon to be swallowed by the same mist that swallowed sound and light. And so they stood, chained and weary, before the black silhouette of the fortress, knowing with a clarity sharper than any blade that they had reached the end of the world they had known. Beyond those gates lay something else, a world that belonged not to men but to misery, and though the guards eventually barked commands and shoved them forward, dragging their unwilling feet toward the open jaws of iron, the prisoners already felt themselves stepping not merely into a building, but into a different existence entirely, one in which days and nights would lose their meaning, in which hope would be a memory too painful to hold, in which the swamp and the walls together would ensure that no man who entered would ever again belong to the living world. Before a prisoner ever set foot within the walls of the swamp fortress, there was still the matter of crossing its outer defenses, for the prison was not merely guarded by stone, but by a series of obstacles that seemed less like deliberate designs of men and more like cruel gifts offered by the swamp itself, each one ensuring that the act of reaching the gates was already an ordeal, a trial that reminded the condemned of how inescapable their fate had become. The first and most immediate of these defenses was the water, for the swamp did not end at the edge of the walls, but rather deepened into wide, stagnant moats that surrounded the fortress on all sides, their surfaces covered in mats of floating vegetation that gave the illusion of solidity, yet any who stepped upon them would sink immediately into the black depths below. The water was foul, thick with the scum of rotting plants, its surface bubbling at times as though something beneath stirred, and the prisoners, chained together as they approached, could not help but stare into its darkness and imagine how many before them had been swallowed whole in failed attempts to swim across. The guards knew well the strength of this barrier, and so they built no graceful bridges of stone or wood to span it, but instead narrow causeways, wooden paths laid upon rotting beams that swayed and creaked underfoot, their surfaces slick with algae, their ropes frayed and damp. To walk upon these causeways was to feel at every step that one might tumble into the water, and for prisoners whose ankles were bound or whose wrists were chained, the danger was even greater. Many stumbled, slipping upon the slimy boards, and each time a guard would haul them upright with a rough grip, for it was not mercy that saved them, but a perverse refusal to allow death to come too soon. The swamp itself demanded patience, and the guards were content to deliver the prisoners slowly, one step at a time, across walkways that sagged beneath their weight, the moats yawning hungrily on either side. Beyond the moats, the ground rose only slightly, yet here too the swamp played its role as a defense, for the soil had been deliberately left unsteady, filled with pits of mud that could swallow a leg or even a whole body if one were careless. Some said that the wardens had dug these pits themselves, widening the natural sinkholes of the swamp so that any who tried to flee would be dragged down, their bodies discovered days later, bloated and pale, drifting on the surface like grim warnings. Others believed that no such effort was needed, that the swamp itself created the traps, shifting and settling in ways that made the ground treacherous, so that no map, no memory, no careful step could ever guarantee safety. Prisoners who looked beyond the walls sometimes thought they saw paths through the reeds, faint trails leading into the distance, but those who followed them, desperate men who hurled themselves from the gates in the hope of freedom, rarely made it more than a few dozen paces before the swamp reclaimed them, their screams carrying faintly across the mist until the waters silenced them forever. Scattered across this outer land were watchtowers, not tall or elegant, but squat wooden structures that leaned slightly with age, their beams darkened by mildew, their ladders slick with damp. From these towers, guards kept constant watch, their eyes trained less on the outside world than on the prisoners within, for they knew that no rescue would come from beyond, no army would march into the swamp to challenge their authority. The towers were not built for defense against invaders, but for vigilance against escape, their narrow slits allowing arrows to be loosed upon any figure seen moving where none should be. At night, faint lanterns burned in these towers, their glow muted by fog, casting eerie halos of light that seemed more like ghostly fires than human signals, and for prisoners chained in the courtyards, it was a reminder that even the darkness of the swamp offered no cover, no chance to slip away unseen. Closer still to the fortress walls, another barrier waited, this one entirely of human design, though it seemed no less cruel than the swamp's natural obstacles. Trenches had been dug, deep and narrow, filled with sharpened stakes whose points jutted upward like a forest of bones, their wood blackened with age, their tips slick with moss. These pits were covered in places with reeds or thin mats of brush, disguising their presence so that any desperate man who ran might find himself suddenly impaled, his cries echoing across the swamp until silence returned once more. The guards took little care to maintain these defenses, for they needed no polish, no perfection. Neglect itself was their weapon, for rot and damp only made the stakes more jagged, more treacherous, ensuring that they tore flesh all the more cruelly when met by accident or desperation. The final barrier before the gates was a wide yard of bare, trodden earth, a space deliberately cleared of cover, so that any prisoner who somehow reached this point would find himself exposed, visible to every arrow from the towers, every eye upon the battlements. The ground here was churned mud, hardened in places by the trampling of boots, soft in others where water pooled, and across its surface lay discarded fragments of chain, broken wood, and in some corners, bones half buried by the soil. To stand in this yard was to feel utterly defenseless, for there was no stone to hide behind, no reed to crouch within, only the wide and pitiless gaze of the fortress itself, its black walls looming higher than ever, its gates closed like a mouth waiting to open. And then, at last, the prisoners were marched forward, the gates grinding open with a sound that seemed to echo inside the skull, a shrieking of rusted hinges that carried with it the weight of countless others who had passed before. The causeways, the moats, the pits, the towers, all of these defenses had done their work before a single step crossed the threshold, for by the time the prisoners reached the open jaws of iron, their hope had already been stripped bare, their courage spent, their strength diminished. The outer defenses were not merely obstacles to keep men from leaving. They were instruments of despair, reminders that even before entering, escape was impossible, and that the swamp itself would conspire with stone and iron to keep them here until their names were forgotten. And so, when the gates finally stood open, and the line of weary, mud-smeared prisoners was driven forward into the darkness beyond, it was not with the resistance of men clinging to hope, but with the shuffling submission of those who knew, as surely as they knew the weight of the chains on their wrists, that the world outside had already vanished, swallowed by water, mud, and mist, leaving only the prison and its endless silence ahead. The gates stood like jaws, massive slabs of iron banded across with bolts that had long since rusted but had not weakened, their hinges swollen with age, yet still capable of groaning open with a sound so deep and so hollow that it seemed to reverberate through the very chest of anyone who heard it. For the prisoners, that sound marked the moment of finality, for as long as they had been marching through the swamp, there had remained some faint illusion that this was merely a journey, a passage from one place to another, and that perhaps, beyond the mist, some reprieve might still be waiting. But when the gates shrieked open, when their shadows fell across the mud, that last illusion shattered, and they understood that this was no longer a journey but an ending, the final crossing into a place that allowed no return. The air that drifted out from behind the gates was colder, not with the chill of stone alone, but with the dampness of centuries, carrying the stench of mildew, rot, and something metallic that clung to the back of the tongue, a reminder that these walls had tasted blood and had absorbed the despair of countless souls who had passed before. The guards drove the prisoners forward, prodding them with the butts of spears or the flat edges of swords, their silence more chilling than any shouted command, for there was no need to speak, no need to remind the condemned of their fate. Chains rattled with every movement, the heavy iron links binding wrist to wrist, ankle to ankle, dragging across the ground with a sound that filled the air more than any voice could, a dull clanking rhythm that seemed to echo from the stones themselves. Each step through the gates was accompanied by that noise, as though the fortress itself welcomed its new inhabitants not with words, but with the symphony of iron. Some men tried to steady their breathing, tried to lift their heads, but the weight of chains pulled them downward, reminding them at every moment of their bondage, and when they glanced sideways, they saw in the faces of their companions only the same mixture of exhaustion and resignation, a mirror of their own despair. The passage beyond the gates was narrow, a corridor of stone that led inward like the throat of some vast creature, swallowing them one by one. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling, cold drops striking faces and shoulders, sliding down skin already damp with sweat and swamp filth, until the prisoners could no longer tell where one moisture ended and another began. The stones themselves were slick, dark with algae, and though torches were fixed at intervals along the walls, their flames did little to drive back the shadows, flickering weakly against the damp air, their smoke curling upward before vanishing into cracks above. Every sound, the dripping water, the scuff of boots, the rattle of chains, was amplified by the narrow passage, so that it seemed to the prisoners that they were walking through a tunnel of echoes, their every movement recorded, magnified, and repeated by the prison itself, as though the walls wanted to remind them that they were no longer individuals but part of a long procession, indistinguishable from the countless who had come before. At the end of the passage stood another set of gates, smaller but no less cruel, their bars thick, their locks enormous, and when these too were dragged open, the noise rang like a funeral bell, marking the passage from the outside world into the true heart of the prison. Here the guards halted the line, and with deliberate slowness they began the ritual that every new arrival endured, the chaining of bodies not only to one another but to the prison itself. One by one, the prisoners were unclasped from the ropes that bound them in lines, only to have heavier chains fastened around their necks and wrists, chains bolted directly into the iron rings fixed into the walls. The process was carried out in silence, the only sound the grinding of metal upon metal, the clicking of locks, the occasional groan of a prisoner forced into place. For many, it was this moment that broke whatever fragment of spirit had survived the march, for there was a difference between being bound by ropes carried through the swamp and being fixed to the very stones of the fortress. Ropes, in their weakness, had allowed at least the illusion of movement, the faint possibility of slipping loose, of cutting free. But the chains were different. They were heavy, unyielding, cold against the skin, biting into flesh with each shift of the body, and the prisoners knew with a clarity that chilled the soul that these would not come off, not in life, not unless some miracle intervened, which the swamp and the prison had conspired to ensure would never happen. The guards, indifferent, moved among them with practiced efficiency, fastening shackles, testing locks, tugging chains to ensure their strength, and never once speaking, for speech would have been wasted. There was nothing to explain, nothing to justify, nothing to offer but the silence of men who had carried out this ritual so often that it had become mechanical. And in their silence, the prisoners heard something louder than words, the confirmation that they were no longer men to these wardens but objects, bodies to be chained, shadows to be stored, numbers that would never be counted. Once secured, the prisoners were left to wait in the dim passage, their bodies pressed against damp stone, their heads bowed under the weight of iron, and it was in this waiting that the reality of the gates sank in. They had crossed from one world into another, from a place where fields and towns and families still existed into a place where time and identity dissolved. Behind them, the gates groaned shut, sealing the corridor with a sound so final that many flinched instinctively as though struck. The clang of iron upon iron echoed long after the gates had closed, ringing in their ears until it seemed that silence would never return. But silence did return, and it was heavier than before, pressing upon them, filling the narrow space with a suffocating stillness that made the heart race and the breath quicken. Some prisoners wept, quietly at first, their tears falling unnoticed among the drops of water from the ceiling, but as the sound grew, others joined, soft sobs mingling with the clank of chains, until the passage became a chorus of grief. The guards did not intervene. They let the weeping continue, for they knew it would not last. Despair, like fire, burned itself out, leaving only ash behind, and soon enough the prisoners would fall silent again, too weary to cry, too broken to resist. The gates had done their work, the chains had done their work, and the swamp fortress had claimed them, body and soul. When at last the guards stirred them once more, dragging them deeper into the prison's interior, the prisoners no longer resisted. They shuffled forward, each movement punctuated by the rattle of chains, each step heavier than the last, and though their eyes still darted about, searching for some sign of weakness in the walls, some crack, some flaw, already they knew the truth. There was no flaw, no weakness, no chance. The gates had closed behind them, the chains had fastened upon them, and whatever lives they had lived before, the homes, the fields, the faces of wives and children, were gone now, sealed away with the sound of rusted iron grinding shut. Ahead lay only darkness, dampness, and the endless echo of despair that had claimed every soul before them. Once the heavy locks had clicked shut and the echo of the closing gates had faded into the damp air, the prisoners were led deeper still, the chains pulling tight between them as they shuffled in unison, their steps slow and clumsy against the uneven stones. The corridor wound downward, a slow descent into the belly of the fortress, and with every step the air grew colder, thicker, until breathing felt like inhaling the very dampness of the walls. The torches fixed into brackets along the way gave off little light, their flames struggling to survive in the moisture-laden air, so that the shadows pressed in heavily from all sides, and the prisoners soon found themselves walking in a half-darkness where faces were half-seen, where walls seemed to stretch endlessly, where time itself dissolved into the monotony of dripping water and clinking chains. The further they went, the stronger the stench became, a stench not only of mildew and rot but of human waste, of sweat and sickness, of unwashed flesh mingling with the foul breath of the swamp that seeped constantly through cracks in the stone. It was a smell that seemed to cling inside the nostrils, coating the throat, making every swallow bitter. At last they reached the cells. The guards halted the line, and one by one the prisoners were unshackled from one another only to be shoved through narrow archways into small chambers cut crudely from the fortress's inner walls. Each cell was no more than a box of stone, barely wide enough for a man to stretch out his arms, and the ceilings were so low that taller prisoners could not stand fully upright. The floors were not dry stone but damp earth, trodden flat by countless feet, and in many places small pools of stagnant water had collected, glistening faintly in the dim light. The walls themselves were slick with slime, cold to the touch, dripping constantly with moisture that ran in slow rivulets down to the floor, so that the air inside was always wet, heavy, and suffocating. There were no beds, no straw mats, not even the crude wooden planks that one might expect in lesser prisons. The only furnishing was the ring of iron fixed into the wall, to which a short chain was attached, and it was to this that each prisoner was bound. The guards worked quickly, fastening shackles to wrists or ankles, their movements efficient, mechanical, done so many times before that no thought was required. Once bound, the prisoners could move only a few paces at most, enough to shuffle back and forth within the narrow space, but never enough to lie fully away from the damp wall, never enough to feel that they had any freedom of motion. The chains clinked whenever they shifted, the sound carrying faintly into the corridor, blending with the chorus of other chains, until the prison itself seemed alive with the metallic whispers of captivity. The dampness was the worst of it, for it was not the clean damp of fresh rain, but the endless seepage of swamp water, laden with filth, seeping through cracks and saturating every surface. At night, when the torches guttered and darkness filled the corridors, the prisoners would hear the slow dripping of water from the ceiling into the pools below, each drop echoing in the silence like a clock that never ceased, a cruel reminder of time's passage in a place where time held no meaning. The moisture clung to their skin, soaking through their rags until their flesh was always wet, softening, blistering, and soon rotting, so that sores and ulcers spread across their bodies, raw and painful, never able to heal in the constant damp. The very act of lying down became torture, for the floor was either mud or stone so cold and wet that it sent shivers through the bones, and sleep, when it came, was broken by the chill, by the bite of insects, by the gnawing ache of muscles forced to rest on unyielding ground. And yet, as terrible as the damp was, The smell was worse, for it never left, never lessened, no matter how long one endured it. The stench of rot filled the lungs at every breath, and mingled with it was the odor of human waste, for there were no latrines, no buckets even, only the corners of the cell, fouled by generations of prisoners who had no choice but to relieve themselves where they were chained. The air grew thick with it, and though the guards occasionally threw handfuls of lime or ashes across the floor, these did little more than add another layer of sharpness to the odor, a bitter sting that burned the nose and eyes but did not cleanse. The smell became part of the prisoners themselves, clinging to their skin, their hair, their very breath, so that even if they had been released, which none ever were, they would have carried the stench of the swamp prison with them as a mark of their suffering. The cells were not places of solitude either, though their size suggested they might be. Often, 2 or even 3 prisoners were crammed into a single cell, their chains fixed close together so that they could not avoid touching, so that their bodies pressed against one another in the narrow dampness, their breaths mingling, their sores rubbing raw against the sores of others. Quarrels broke out, sharp and vicious, for space was a luxury none could afford, and yet these quarrels rarely lasted long, for the prison had a way of sapping anger as much as hope. Men grew too weak to fight, too tired to argue, their voices dwindling into mutters, their eyes sinking into hollowness. In time, they stopped speaking altogether, the silence of despair spreading from cell to cell until the corridors were filled not with shouts or cries, but with the faint moans of sickness, the rattling of chains, and the endless dripping of water. The walls, too, seemed alive with rot, for in the cracks and corners molds grew thick and green, their spores filling the air, choking lungs and burning throats. Rats scurried along the edges, bold and unafraid, feeding on scraps of moldy bread thrown carelessly into the cells, and when scraps were not enough, they gnawed at the prisoners themselves, nipping toes and fingers as they slept, biting into festering sores. Insects swarmed constantly, mosquitoes feasting on blood, flies buzzing over wounds and waste alike, leaving behind larvae that wriggled in the filth. There was no escaping them, no reprieve, and in this way the swamp itself crept into the cells, reminding the prisoners that even within walls they could not leave behind the mire. For those who had survived other prisons, the shock of these cells was profound, for they realized quickly that this was no place of confinement meant to hold men until trial or sentence. This was a place of slow death, where rot was not an accident but the very design, where dampness, stench, and disease were as much a part of the punishment as chains and whips. Each detail, from the dripping water to the crawling vermin, seemed intended to break the body and spirit alike, to erase not only freedom but dignity, until the men within ceased to think of themselves as men at all, reduced instead to shadows clinging to life out of habit rather than hope. And as they lay against the cold walls, their chains pulling tight whenever they shifted, listening to the endless chorus of drips and moans, the truth pressed upon them as heavily as the damp air. They were not here to be imprisoned in the sense the word once held, but to be consumed, slowly, piece by piece, until they dissolved into the swamp as countless others had before them. The cells were not merely cages but graves, waiting patiently, their stones already steeped in the memory of death, their walls thick with the silence of names forgotten, their dampness a reminder that in time all flesh softened, all bones sank, and all lives were swallowed whole by rot. It was often said by those few who had glimpsed the swamp fortress and lived long enough to whisper their accounts that the prison was not merely built beside the swamp, but was part of it, that the waters and the walls had long ago struck an unspoken pact, each feeding the misery of the other, so that no prisoner within could ever forget where he was, for even in the deepest chambers of stone, the swamp made itself known, creeping, seeping. pressing in with its foul breath and endless hunger. The cells themselves bore witness to this truth, their dampness no accident of poor construction, but the living hand of the swamp pushing through cracks and pores, spreading moisture across every surface until the walls sweated constantly, until the air never dried. And it was not only dampness that seeped inward, but the creatures of the mire as well, for the swamp did not respect the barriers of iron or stone, but sent its emissaries crawling through holes, slithering along corridors, swimming through flooded pits that collected in the prison's lower passages. By day, when the dim torchlight flickered across the walls and guards moved with their heavy boots echoing on the stones, the swamp was always there, in the buzzing of insects that drifted in clouds through the corridors, in the frogs that croaked from unseen cracks, in the faint rustling of reeds that had somehow taken root in corners where soil had gathered. Mosquitoes were a constant torment, swarming thickly in the still, wet air, feasting upon the blood of prisoners who had no strength to swat them away, leaving welts and sores that never healed, their itching maddening, their bites opening doors for infection to fester. Flies gathered wherever filth collected, laying their eggs in wounds, in scraps of food, in the corners fouled by waste, so that maggots wriggled openly in places where men tried to sleep. At times, snakes found their way inside, thin bodies sliding soundlessly through cracks, their movements so quiet that a prisoner often did not know he was not alone until he felt the cold brush of scales against his leg or heard the sudden, sharp hiss in the darkness. Some were venomous, and their bites brought fever and death, but most were not. And yet even those harmless ones spread terror, for in the darkness of the cell, the imagination turned every movement into a mortal threat. The swamp water itself rose and fell within the fortress as though the prison were breathing with the land. In times of heavy rain, the lower cells flooded, water seeping across the floors, rising slowly until it soaked the prisoners where they sat chained against the walls, forcing them to draw their knees to their chests, their rags floating about them, the stench of rot intensifying as waste and decay mixed into the rising pool. There were stories of men drowning in their own cells, too weak to lift themselves higher, their chains too short to allow escape, their bodies discovered days later slumped sideways, half submerged, eyes open and staring as though the swamp had reached in to claim them directly. Even when the waters receded, they left behind layers of slime and silt, coating every surface with a slick film that never dried, making the stones slippery underfoot, filling the air with the odor of stagnant decay. The sound of the swamp never ceased, not even within the deepest passages. The prisoners heard it always, the buzzing of insects, the croaking of frogs, the faint splash of something unseen slipping into water. At night, when torches burned low and darkness smothered the corridors, those sounds grew louder, echoing in the silence until they filled the mind. Some swore they could hear voices in the croaks and the drips, whispering their names, calling them deeper into madness. Others claimed to hear the cries of the dead, carried in the sigh of mist that drifted through cracks, as though the swamp itself remembered every life it had swallowed and sang softly of its triumph. Sleep, already broken by cold and chains, became nearly impossible in such a chorus, for even when exhaustion forced the eyes closed, the sounds lingered, creeping into dreams, twisting them into nightmares that left the dreamer trembling, gasping, wide-eyed in the darkness. The swamp also brought sickness, for in its waters bred countless unseen afflictions. Fever spread like fire among the prisoners, their bodies burning one day and shivering the next, sweat pouring down their skin even as they shook with cold, their eyes glassy, their voices hoarse. Rashes bloomed across their flesh where swamp water had soaked their sores. Infections turned small wounds into swollen, oozing injuries that stank of decay. The very air seemed filled with pestilence, heavy with spores of mold, with the breath of decay, so that lungs grew weak, coughs tore through throats, blood stained lips and rags alike. The swamp was not content merely to surround them. It entered them, made a home of their bodies, consumed them from within, until they became as much a part of its rot as the reeds and the slime. The guards themselves were not immune, though they kept to the higher chambers where the dampness was less suffocating and the air moved slightly more freely. Still, even they suffered fevers, their skin pocked with bites, their tempers shortened by sleepless nights filled with the constant drone of insects. They wrapped themselves in thick cloths, burned herbs to ward off the pests, but the swamp crept through every defense, leaving its mark on all who lingered in its shadow. Yet the guards endured, for they had the privilege of leaving when their term was done, of walking back across the causeways and into the world beyond. For the prisoners, there was no such reprieve. The swamp was their constant companion, their jailer more than the guards, their executioner more than the chains. And perhaps the cruelest truth was that over time, the prisoners came to accept its presence, to cease recoiling from the dampness, to cease swatting at the insects, to cease shuddering when snakes brushed past in the night. Their senses dulled, their spirits broken, they grew used to the swamp's embrace, as though it had seeped not only into their flesh but into their very minds, teaching them to stop resisting, to lie still in the rot, to breathe the foul air without complaint, to listen to the endless chorus without protest. The swamp had become their world, and in its constant touch, they forgot the feel of dryness, of silence, of light. They became creatures of the mire, half living, half decayed, waiting only for the moment when the swamp, patient as always, would claim the last of them. Thus, the swamp was never outside the prison. It was always inside, always pressing its damp hand against every stone, always breathing its foul breath into every mouth, always whispering in every ear. The chains bound their bodies, the guards held their names, but it was the swamp that held their souls, wrapping them in rot and silence, reminding them at every moment that this was not merely a prison built in a swamp. It was the swamp itself, given walls and gates, a place where nature and cruelty had become one, and where no man could ever be free. The guards of the swamp prison were unlike soldiers or wardens elsewhere, for they seemed less like men of duty and more like shadows given form, their presence heavy yet their voices rarely heard, their movements slow but deliberate, as though the very silence of the swamp had seeped into their bones and made them part of its stillness. They did not shout commands as guards in city prisons might, nor did they bark orders with the sharpness of men who enjoyed authority, for in this place words were unnecessary. The prisoners understood without being told that resistance was futile, and so the guards spoke little, their silence becoming a weapon more powerful than any whip. When they did speak, it was often in murmurs, clipped and cold, never wasted on comfort or explanation, only on the minimal necessity of keeping the machinery of misery turning. Their appearance, too, reflected the swamp they served. Their uniforms, once perhaps marked with the colors of some authority, were perpetually stained, the fabric darkened by damp, the leather straps covered in mildew, the boots caked with layers of swamp mud that never fully came clean. Helmets or hoods often shadowed their faces, so that only glimpses of eyes were seen, and even those eyes seemed dulled, lifeless, as though they had grown accustomed to staring at despair until no spark remained. Their skin was pale in the dim torchlight, often blotched with the marks of insects or the rashes of swamp air, and the smell of their bodies carried the same mixture of sweat, mold, and smoke as the prison itself. Yet, unlike the prisoners, they bore this decay with a kind of grim indifference, as though they had accepted that to serve in this place was to surrender to the swamp, to let it claim them slowly in exchange for the privilege of leaving alive. They moved in pairs or small groups, never hurrying, never rushing, their boots striking the stones with a slow rhythm that prisoners learned to recognize long before the figures appeared. That sound, steady and heavy, carried down corridors, echoed in the cells, and filled the silence with a dread all its own. The approach of guards was not always accompanied by punishment or cruelty. Often they came only to deliver scraps of food or to check the locks of chains. But the sound itself was enough to tighten throats and quicken breaths, for the guards were never predictable, and their silence left prisoners guessing whether the visit would bring stale bread or the sting of a lash. Cruelty was part of their nature, but it was not the loud, boastful cruelty of men who revel in their power. It was instead a quiet, detached cruelty, the kind born not of rage but of apathy. They did not shout when they struck, nor curse when they whipped. Their blows fell in silence, their lashes whistled without exclamation, and when prisoners cried out, their voices echoed unanswered, fading into the damp walls as the guards moved away with no more concern than if they had swatted an insect. This indifference was worse than open hatred, for hatred at least acknowledged the humanity of its target, while silence denied it, reducing the prisoners to nothing more than burdens to be chained, fed, and eventually discarded. In the courtyards, when prisoners were forced into labor, the guards stood at the edges, their arms crossed, their faces hidden in shadow, watching without comment. They did not encourage nor threaten. They simply observed, and the prisoners, exhausted and half-starved, worked not out of fear of shouted orders, but out of the deeper terror of silence, for silence in this place was never benign. It pressed upon the mind, made men doubt themselves, made them wonder whether they were already forgotten, whether they had ceased to exist in the eyes of their captors, whether even their suffering mattered at all. The guards' stillness and their wordless stares were reminders that the prisoners' lives were worth less than speech, less than sound, less than the buzzing of flies in the air. At night, the presence of the guards was felt even when they could not be seen. Their footsteps carried faintly along the walkways above the cells, their lanterns glowing dimly through the mist, their silhouettes passing like ghosts against the dripping walls. Prisoners, chained and sleepless, would stare upward, watching those flickering lights, listening to the muted thud of boots, and feel the weight of their watchfulness pressing down. No words were exchanged, no commands given, yet the message was clear. You are never alone, never unobserved, never free even in your chains. The silence of the guards was constant as the dampness of the swamp, a second skin that wrapped itself around every man and smothered him slowly. There were whispers, among the few who ever dared to speculate, that the guards themselves were prisoners of another kind, men condemned not to chains but to service, bound by duty to a place that consumed them as surely as it consumed those they watched. Their silence, some believed, was born not of choice but of resignation, the knowledge that to serve here was to give up the right to speech, to allow the swamp to fill one's mouth with mist and one's lungs with rot. Whether true or not, such stories spread easily, for the guards rarely left the fortress, and when they did, they departed changed, their eyes hollow, their voices faint, as though something of the swamp never released its grip on them. To the prisoners, it mattered little whether the guards were willing servants or unwilling captives, for the effect was the same. A constant presence of figures who did not need to shout to command obedience, who did not need to explain to make their meaning known, whose silence was heavier than any chain. Each rattle of keys, each creak of boots, each faint cough or muttered word between them was magnified by the stillness, so that even the smallest sound became a reminder of their power. And in their silence lay the deepest cruelty, for it left the prisoners alone with their thoughts, alone with the dripping water and buzzing insects, alone with the creeping rot of despair. Thus, the guards were not merely overseers, but extensions of the prison itself, embodiments of its silence, its indifference, its slow erasure of life. They were the swamp given human form, walking in boots instead of mud, carrying chains instead of reeds, their silence as suffocating as the mist that wrapped around the walls. To face them was not to face men, but to face the inevitability of decay, the certainty of death without recognition, and the knowledge that in this place no cry, no plea, no word would ever find an answer. If the chains and the dampness broke the body, and the silence of the guards broke the spirit, then it was the food, or what passed for food, that eroded whatever faint strength remained, reducing men to husks kept alive only long enough to suffer further. For in the swamp prison, nourishment was not given with the intention of sustaining life, but with the precise purpose of keeping it lingering on the edge, never strong enough to resist, never comfortable enough to rest, never full enough to forget hunger even for an hour. Each meal was a reminder of the contempt in which the prisoners were held, a ritual humiliation carried out not with words, but with the offerings of rot and scraps, given as if to beasts, never to men. What arrived at the cells was rarely recognizable as food at all. In the mornings, if morning could be discerned through the mist and the darkness, the guards shuffled along the corridors carrying buckets, their contents sloshing as they moved, and from these buckets they ladled out a watery gruel, thin as broth, gray in color, with an odor that suggested it had been boiled from the sweepings of grain storage or from husks gnawed by rats. The liquid was poured into crude wooden bowls, sometimes into hollowed stones, sometimes simply onto the damp floor itself, where the prisoners were left to lap at it like animals. Within the gruel floated occasional lumps, hard grains, bits of moldy root, fragments of spoiled vegetable, but never enough to fill a stomach, never enough to lend strength to arms that trembled constantly from weakness. At midday, another ration came, though it differed little in quality. Hard crusts of bread, already blackened in spots with mold, were tossed through the iron bars into the cells, landing in the mud, where they became coated instantly with filth. The prisoners still scrambled for them, for hunger made pride irrelevant, and the guards sometimes lingered to watch the spectacle, their expressionless faces unreadable, though their silence seemed almost amused. The bread, when chewed, was so dry it scraped the throat, so tough it cracked teeth, and yet it had no weight in the stomach, vanishing almost at once into the endless emptiness within. At times the crusts were accompanied by scraps of salted meat, though these were often rancid, their smell sour and sharp, their taste foul enough to make men retch even as they forced themselves to swallow. Flies gathered quickly, buzzing thickly around the meat, and rats were bold in their attempts to steal it, darting into the cells to snatch fragments from weakened hands. Water was provided, but it was not the clean flow of wells or rivers. Instead, it was swamp water, drawn straight from the pools that surrounded the fortress, green-tinged and foul, filled with silt and insect larvae, its surface often oily, its taste bitter and choking. Guards sometimes strained it through cloth, but more often it was given as it was, sloshing in buckets, poured into bowls already crusted with slime. To drink it was to swallow the swamp itself, to invite its sickness inward, yet there was no choice, for thirst was worse than disgust, and the human body demanded water even when every drop carried fever with it. Those who refused found themselves collapsing quickly, their lips cracking, their tongues swelling, and so they drank, knowing that each mouthful drew them closer to sickness but unable to resist the pull of their own survival. Evening brought the last portion, and it was little different from what came before. A thin stew of whatever scraps remained, bones with little flesh clinging to them, peels, the ends of roots, fragments of grain, boiled together into a foul-smelling slurry that was ladled out with the same indifference as all else. Sometimes, if luck could be counted in such a place, a prisoner would find a morsel of fat, a shred of meat, but more often than not it was only the vague flavor of salt and rot. The prisoners huddled over it, eating quickly before rats or insects could take their share, each mouthful swallowed not for pleasure but for survival, the act mechanical, joyless, without taste beyond the dull bitterness of decay. The food did its work well, for it never strengthened, only weakened slowly. Bellies cramped constantly, muscles wasted, skin clung tighter to bone with each passing week. Men who had entered broad-shouldered and strong became gaunt, their ribs pressing against their skin, their eyes hollowed by hunger. Their movements slowed, their steps grew uncertain, their hands trembled uncontrollably, and even speech faltered, voices reduced to whispers as energy drained from their bodies. Some gnawed on leather straps, some scraped mold from the walls in desperation, some even fought over rats, killing them with bare hands and consuming them raw before others could steal the prize. Hunger stripped away not only flesh but dignity, until men no longer thought of themselves as men at all, only as creatures whose only thought was the next mouthful, the next crust, the next chance to swallow something that might quiet the gnawing ache within. The cruelty of the food was not in its scarcity alone, but in the ritual of its delivery. Guards often tossed the rations carelessly, letting them fall into filth, forcing prisoners to crawl across the mud to retrieve them, their chains rattling, their sores reopening as they dragged themselves through the slime. Sometimes the food was deliberately withheld, a punishment for imagined disobedience, so that entire cells went days with nothing but water, watching each other weaken, watching some collapse and not rise again. Other times, the guards gave more than usual, not enough to sustain, but enough to tempt gluttony, only to stand back and watch prisoners tear at one another for scraps, their silence broken only by the sound of bodies colliding, chains clattering, groans of pain as men clawed and bit for fragments of moldy bread. In these moments, the prison itself seemed to mock them, reminding them that hunger was as sharp a chain as any iron shackle. Illness spread through food as much as through dampness. The spoiled meat, the tainted water, the moldy bread, all carried sickness with them, and fevers often followed a meal, men shivering violently, their stomachs twisting until they emptied what little they had consumed onto the filthy floor. Others grew too weak to keep anything down, their bodies rejecting even the thin gruel, until they wasted away more quickly, sinking into weakness so complete that they could not lift themselves when the next ration arrived. To watch a man starve in a place where food was given daily was a cruelty beyond measure, for it showed how carefully designed the torment was, how precisely the balance had been struck, enough to prolong suffering, never enough to sustain hope. Over time, the prisoners ceased to think of meals as nourishment at all. They became markers of time, indistinguishable from one another, each one reminding them that another day had passed, another day survived, another day endured without release. The gruel, the crusts, the stew, these were not food but instruments of despair, reducing men to shadows of themselves, bodies alive but hollow, minds dulled by hunger and weakness, spirits eroded until the thought of resistance was as impossible as the thought of feasting. The swamp prison fed them only to watch them starve, nourished them only to prolong their decay, and in this way the food itself became part of the punishment, Another chain, another weapon, another reminder that in this place, life was not meant to be lived, but only to be endured until death came as the only mercy left. When the last scraps of foul stew had been swallowed and the clatter of bowls against stone had died away, there remained nothing but the slow sinking of the prison into its longest torment, the night, which here was not a passage of hours but a weight, a suffocating blanket that smothered every breath, every thought, every faint glimmer of spirit that had somehow survived the day. For in this place, night was not marked by the stars or the moon, which rarely pierced the mists of the swamp, nor by any bell or call that might have offered a rhythm to the darkness. It came instead as a gradual deepening of gloom, as the torches guttered and were left to burn themselves out, their flames flickering lower and lower until at last only embers glowed faintly against the wet walls, and then even those embers vanished, leaving the prisoners in a darkness so complete it felt less like absence of light and more like burial. The endless night of the swamp prison was not silent, for silence here was never empty. It was filled with sounds that pressed themselves into the ears of every man chained to his wall, sounds that came not only from the prison itself, but from the swamp beyond, which seemed to grow louder when the sun was gone. The drip of water became constant, a rhythm that fell without pattern, droplets striking stone, iron, flesh, always somewhere near, always somewhere far, so that no prisoner could tell where it began or where it would end. Insects swarmed thickly in the dark, their buzzing a ceaseless hum, interrupted only by the sharp sting of a bite or the tickle of wings brushing against the skin. Frogs croaked in the distance, deep and resonant, their voices rising and falling in a chorus that sometimes sounded like laughter, sometimes like mourning. And beneath it all came the occasional splash, the movement of something unseen in the waters that surrounded the fortress, reminding every ear that even in the night, the swamp was alive, restless, and always listening. Within the walls, other sounds mingled with these, the rattle of chains as men shifted restlessly in their bonds, the groans of bodies aching from sores and hunger, the coughs that tore through chests weakened by damp air, the quiet sobs of those who still had strength to weep. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of darkness, a scream would echo suddenly through the corridors, raw and piercing, tearing through the night like a wound. It might come from a prisoner in the grip of fever, or from one who dreamed of drowning, or from another tormented beyond endurance by the crawling of rats across his skin. The scream would carry, bouncing against the stones, magnified until it seemed to come from every corner, and then, slowly, it would fade, swallowed by the weight of darkness, leaving behind only the heavy breathing of the terrified and the indifferent dripping of water. Sleep, if it came at all, was never gentle. The damp floors chilled bones until teeth chattered, the vermin gnawed and crawled without pause, and the stomach's gnawing emptiness never allowed true rest. Men drifted in and out of shallow slumber, their dreams twisted by hunger and fear, filled with visions of feasts that dissolved into rot, of sunlight that turned to mist, of homecomings that ended with the rattle of chains. These dreams were often worse than wakefulness, for waking in the dark cell was at least a familiar misery, while dreams reminded them of a life beyond these walls, of faces and fields and skies that seemed now like fantasies, too distant to be real. And so many chose to fight against sleep, clinging to wakefulness as though it might spare them, only to find themselves drifting despite themselves, sinking into nightmares that felt longer than the night itself. For those who remained awake, the night stretched endlessly, each moment indistinguishable from the last, until hours seemed to fold into one another, creating an eternity of darkness. The mind, deprived of sight, turned inward, and in that inwardness lurked madness. Men began to hear voices in the darkness, whispers that were not the sounds of frogs or insects, but the remembered tones of mothers, wives, children, long dead or long lost. Some spoke to these voices, murmuring into the blackness, answering questions that were never asked, laughing quietly, weeping openly. Others fell into silence so deep that they seemed already gone, their breathing faint, their eyes staring blankly though no light revealed them. Madness grew like mold in the night, spreading quietly, feeding on fear and despair, until the line between dream and waking was no longer clear, until men no longer trusted their own thoughts, until the endless night seemed not a passing shadow but a permanent state. The guards moved rarely in these hours, for even they seemed reluctant to wander the corridors when the swamp pressed in most heavily. When they did pass by, their lanterns cast brief circles of dim light, illuminating gaunt faces for a moment before plunging them back into darkness, leaving behind the echo of their boots and the faint jangle of keys. Their silence was heavier at night than in the day, for no commands were given, no punishments delivered. Their very presence was enough, a reminder that even in the blackest hours, the prisoners were watched, observed, held tightly in the grip of chains that never loosened. The lanterns would pass, the steps would fade, and the darkness would return, heavier than before, as though it had never been broken. Time lost meaning in the endless night. Without the light of moon or stars, without the change of guards marked by bells, the prisoners had no way of measuring the hours. For some, the night seemed only moments long, for they slipped quickly into delirium, their minds erasing the passage of time. For others, it stretched into eternity, each second a weight upon the chest, each breath an effort, each sound amplified into torment. And when at last faint torchlight returned, when the guards came once more with their buckets of gruel and their rattling chains, it was impossible to know whether the night had lasted hours, days, or an eternity. The prisoners emerged from it not rested, not renewed, but more broken than before, their eyes hollow, their limbs trembling, their voices hoarse from silence. Yet the cruelest truth of the endless night was that it always returned. No matter how long a man endured its suffocating blackness, no matter how much strength he wasted fighting against its madness, he knew with certainty that when the day passed again, when the scraps of food were delivered, when the labor ended, the darkness would come once more, swallowing him whole, dragging him into another eternity of damp, buzzing, dripping, whispering despair. The endless night was not merely a passage of hours in this prison. It was the true essence of the place, a constant reminder that here, in the swamp fortress, there was no light, no hope, no dawn that could truly banish the shadows. There was only darkness, and in that darkness, the slow dissolution of all that had once been human. When the dim torchlight returned after a night that had felt like a suffocating eternity, and when the gruel had been ladled out in its thin and tasteless form, the prisoners were not left to rest in their chains, nor were they given time to recover from the dampness that gnawed at their bones and the hunger that hollowed their bellies. Instead, the guards came with keys and with rods, unlocking shackles from the walls only to fasten them together in chains that linked man to man, binding them into stumbling groups that could be driven like cattle. Their voices were not raised, for shouting was unnecessary in this place, but the butt of a spear, the jab of a rod, or the pull of a chain was enough to make the weary rise and move forward, their limbs trembling, their sores splitting anew as they shuffled into the yards and passageways where the day's labor awaited them. It was called work, but in truth it was nothing of the sort, for it produced nothing of value, no harvest, no construction, no craft. The work of despair was labor designed not to build but to break, to drain the body of strength and the mind of purpose until only exhaustion remained. Sometimes they were made to haul heavy stones, carrying them from one end of the yard to the other, piling them against the wall only to be ordered, hours later, to move them back again. The stones were slick with moss, heavy enough to tear at flesh already raw from chains, and when they slipped from weary hands, the guards struck with rods or whips, leaving welts that stung in the damp air. Other times, they were driven into the swamp itself, forced to cut reeds with dull blades, their bodies sinking into the mire up to their knees, the water crawling with insects, leeches attaching themselves to ankles and thighs, blood seeping slowly as the men labored on without pause. The swamp muck was another task. The prisoners handed crude shovels and ordered to scoop the black sludge from pools and ditches, carrying it in buckets that leaked and spilled, their bodies bent under the weight, their lungs choking on the stench. The muck was piled in heaps that served no purpose, for when rains came, the swamp reclaimed it, spreading it back into the ditches and pools, and the next day the labor began again. Some whispered that the guards themselves did not know why the work was ordered, that it was commanded only because it kept the prisoners occupied, because it gave them no time to plot or dream, no strength left to resist. But others believed the uselessness of the work was its true purpose, for there is no cruelty sharper than forcing men to expend their last fragments of strength on tasks that achieve nothing, to waste their days on circles of labor that left behind only exhaustion and despair. The labor yards were bare and open, surrounded by the looming walls and the watchtowers where silent guards stood, their eyes fixed upon the struggling men below. No shade was offered from the sun when it broke briefly through the mist, no shelter from the rain when storms swept across the swamp, no reprieve from the buzzing clouds of insects that swarmed in thicker numbers by day than by night. The ground was always wet, always slick, and the prisoners slipped constantly, falling into the mud, their chains tangling, their bodies trampled by those forced to stumble on behind them. When one fell and could not rise, the guards did not stop the line. They dragged him aside with hooks, leaving him in the mud until he found strength to stand or until he did not move again. The hours stretched endlessly, for there were no bells to mark time, no signals of progress, only the steady rhythm of labor and pain. The only breaks came when guards sloshed buckets of swamp water into the yards, forcing the prisoners to drink quickly before the water spilled into the mud, and when scraps of bread were tossed carelessly at midday, already soggy from damp hands, already chewed at by insects. The men swallowed quickly, barely tasting, before being driven back to their tasks, their bodies groaning under the endless repetition. The swamp sun, when it appeared, dried nothing, only thickened the air with heat, making the dampness cling more heavily, making breath itself laborious. And when the mist returned, curling around the walls, it offered no comfort, for it chilled the skin and deepened the ache in bones already weary. Some prisoners broke quickly under such work, collapsing within days, their bodies too frail to endure the endless hauling, the sucking mud, the weight of chains. Others lasted longer, their strength preserved by stubbornness or by memories that still lingered, but even these eventually gave way, their eyes hollowing, their steps slowing, their shoulders bending lower each day. The guards watched impassively, making no distinction between those who faltered and those who endured, for to them all were destined to meet the same end: exhaustion, collapse, and silence. The swamp prison had no need for executioners when labor itself could kill slowly, stealing life one drop at a time until the body was an empty shell. Perhaps the cruelest part of the work was its futility, for even as men sweated and bled, the swamp erased their efforts almost instantly. The reeds they cut grew back within days, taller and thicker than before. The muck they hauled seeped back into the ditches with the next rain. The stones they moved returned to their original place at the command of a guard who cared nothing for the repetition. And so the prisoners learned quickly that their labor had no end, no purpose, no completion. A wall built might be torn down the next day, a ditch cleared might be filled again the next. There was no satisfaction in finishing, no rest at completion, for there was no completion at all. Work here was a circle, endless and consuming, designed only to grind down the body and erase the will. When night finally came, and the prisoners were chained once more to the walls of their cells, they collapsed not into rest but into a stupor, their bodies aching, their stomachs empty, their minds dulled. Sleep came not from peace, but from exhaustion so complete that even the crawling of vermin could not always keep it away, though the endless night offered little comfort. And when the next day dawned, indistinguishable from the last, the work began again, dragging men deeper into despair, turning them slowly into creatures of mud and chain, their humanity stripped away one pointless task at a time. Thus the work of despair accomplished what no whip or chain alone could achieve. It reduced men not only to weakness but to emptiness, teaching them that effort was meaningless, that struggle led nowhere, that each drop of sweat was swallowed by the swamp before it touched the earth. It was not labor for survival, nor labor for punishment, but labor for erasure, and in its endless repetition, it ensured that no man who endured it could hold on to hope for long. In the swamp prison, work itself was the slowest execution, one that left no wound but drained life all the same, until nothing remained but silence and mud. Disease was as constant a companion in the swamp prison as the chains or the dampness, for in a place where the air was thick with rot, where the water was drawn from stagnant pools, where men slept on filth and labored in mud, sickness was not an occasional misfortune but the very rhythm of life. It clung to the prisoners like the mist, creeping into their lungs, festering in their skin, spreading from body to body until there was no man untouched, no breath free of coughing, no limb free of sores. It was not the sudden violence of plague that swept through cities like fire, but a slower, crueler rot, a lingering decay that ate away at the body inch by inch, leaving men alive enough to suffer, yet never strong enough to resist. The damp air carried fevers that rose and fell without pattern, leaving men shivering beneath rags 1 hour and drenched in sweat the next, their eyes glassy, their lips cracked, their voices reduced to hoarse whispers. The swamp water, tainted and foul, filled their stomachs with parasites and unseen afflictions, so that bellies swelled grotesquely even as ribs showed sharply beneath the skin, and diarrhea drained what little strength remained. Wounds, whether from labor, punishment, or the simple rubbing of chains against flesh, never healed, for the moisture kept them perpetually open, turning scratches into ulcers, blisters into gaping sores, each one oozing pus, each one feeding the swarms of flies that buzzed thickly in the air. The very walls seemed to exhale sickness, their mold-releasing spores that filled the lungs, clogging them until coughs racked the body, deep and wet, spattering flecks of blood onto the slimy stone. The guards did not care, for disease was as useful a tool of the prison as chains or hunger. When a man grew too weak to labor, he was dragged aside, chained still but left to lie in the corner, his breathing ragged, his eyes half closed, his skin clammy. Sometimes the guards allowed him to linger until death came naturally. Days later, his body wasted, his breath rattling until it ceased. Other times, when space was needed or impatience grew, they dragged the sick out into the swamp and left them half submerged, the mud swallowing them slowly, their cries muffled by the reeds until silence returned. The prisoners learned not to protest, for they knew the same fate awaited them in time, and the swamp was always hungry, always willing to take what the prison no longer wished to hold. Illness spread quickly in the cramped cells, where men were chained together in close quarters, their bodies pressed against one another, their sores rubbing, their coughs spraying into the air that all breathed. A single fevered prisoner could infect an entire row within days, and once the sickness took root, it never left, for there was no medicine, no herbs, no clean water to wash wounds. Men tried to care for one another as best they could, sharing scraps of food, wiping sweat from brows, murmuring words of comfort, but kindness withered quickly in the face of such despair. When food was scarce, when thirst gnawed at the throat, when strength failed, even compassion could not survive, and the sick were often left to collapse where they sat, their chains rattling faintly until they grew still. The stench of disease filled the air, mingling with the rot of the swamp, a sharp, sickly sweetness that clung to the nostrils, that lingered in the throat. It was the smell of bodies wasting, of wounds festering, of infection spreading unchecked. Even the guards, indifferent though they were, kept their distance when entering the cells, pulling cloths across their mouths, moving quickly, leaving as soon as their duty allowed. Yet no cloth, no distance, could truly protect them, and they too coughed, they too grew pale, their lips blue in the damp torchlight, their hands trembling slightly as they carried buckets of water. Some of them died as well, though their bodies were carried away swiftly, removed before the prisoners could see, for the illusion of authority had to be preserved, the illusion that the guards were untouchable, immune. But the swamp claimed them all, in time. The prisoners themselves spoke of the sickness as though it were another guard, another overseer, for it dictated their days as surely as whips or chains. Men who coughed too long were eyed warily by their companions, not out of cruelty but out of fear, for everyone knew that to lie beside the sick was to join them. Whispers spread in the darkness, of who had grown pale, of who had begun to shiver, of who would not last the week. Some prayed quietly for relief, though not for healing was unknown here. They prayed instead for quick death, for release from the lingering torment of fever that never broke, of sores that never closed, of lungs that never cleared. But quick death rarely came, and the sickness lingered, dragging men through weeks of agony before finally delivering them into the silence of the swamp. The worst of all were the fevers of the mind, the deliriums that came when the body burned too hot for too long. Men raved in their chains, shouting at shadows, clawing at the air, striking their own bodies against the walls in fits of madness. They saw visions in the darkness, faces of loved ones long lost, fields of wheat swaying under a sun they could no longer remember, feasts that dissolved into crawling vermin the moment they reached for them. Their screams pierced the endless night, their laughter echoed hollowly through the damp corridors, and the other prisoners turned away, covering their ears as best they could, for madness was contagious too, and to hear such ravings for too long was to feel the edge of reason slipping as well. Eventually, the delirious grew too weak to thrash, too hoarse to scream, and they sank into stillness, their eyes staring wide at ceilings dripping with slime, their mouths open in silence. And yet the prison did not empty. For every body claimed by fever, another arrived, dragged across the swamp, chained to the wall, set to labor until the same slow sickness consumed him. The disease that lingered was not an accident, but a cycle, part of the very design of the place, a tool as sharp as any blade, as effective as any executioner. It was cheaper than gallows, quieter than swords, and far more terrifying, for it left men to wither slowly, to watch others wither beside them, to feel the rot creeping into their own flesh with no escape, no mercy, no end. Thus, the swamp prison was never still, never free of the rattling cough, the moan of fever, the whimper of those too weak to stand. Disease lingered as surely as the mist, wrapping itself around every man, creeping into every lung, seeping into every wound. It was the air they breathed, the water they drank, the stone they touched, the darkness they slept in. And though death was inevitable, it was never swift, never kind, never clean. It came slowly, patiently, like the swamp itself, swallowing men piece by piece, leaving behind only silence, only rot, only the memory of names long forgotten. If disease was the swamp's punishment, creeping slow and inevitable through every breath and drop of water, then the punishments delivered by the guards were the fortress's own cruelty, deliberate and direct, carried out not to maintain order, for order was never threatened in a place so heavy with despair, but to remind the prisoners that their suffering was not merely the work of nature and time, but of human will as well. That cruelty here had both design and intention. The chains and dampness had already stripped men of their dignity. Hunger gnawed at them without pause. Fever burned their bodies from within, and yet the guards, silent and watchful, found reason to inflict further pain, not because it was necessary, but because it was tradition, part of the ritual of keeping hopelessness absolute. Punishment could come for any reason or for none at all. A prisoner who coughed too loudly in the night, disturbing the silence of the corridor, might be hauled from his chains and beaten until his body lay limp upon the floor. Another who failed to lift a stone quickly enough in the labor yard, his strength drained by fever and hunger, might be struck with a rod across the back until welts rose and blood seeped through his rags. Sometimes the guards punished not the weak but the strong, selecting men who still stood straighter than others, who still met eyes rather than lowering them, for strength itself was an offense in this place, a challenge to the atmosphere of submission. Such men were whipped until their spirits broke, until they too shuffled with bent shoulders and hollow gazes, indistinguishable from the rest. The instruments of punishment were as crude as the prison itself. Rods of wood, blackened with damp, were used until they splintered, leaving fragments embedded in flesh. Whips, stiffened with mold, cracked across backs and legs, tearing open sores that never healed. Iron chains doubled as tools of torment, their links heated in fire before being pressed against skin, their weight increased and draped upon necks until men collapsed under the strain. In the yards, prisoners were sometimes forced into stocks, their heads and hands locked in place, their bodies bent forward in unnatural positions that left muscles cramping, blood pooling, pain searing through every joint. They were left there for hours, sometimes days, their mouths too dry to cry out, their sores festering in the damp air, insects crawling freely across their exposed flesh. One of the cruelest punishments was drowning by inches, carried out not to kill but to terrify. Prisoners were led into shallow pits dug into the swamp itself, chained so that they could not rise higher than their knees, and then left as water slowly seeped in, creeping upward until it reached their chests, their necks, sometimes their chins. The mud clung to their bodies, sucking at their legs, pulling them downward, while insects feasted on their faces and arms. The guards would watch silently from the edges, never intervening, never striking, allowing terror itself to be the torment. At the last moment, before the swamp could finish its work, the prisoners were pulled out, coughing, gasping, half dead with fear, their chains dragging behind them. They were thrown back into their cells, and though they lived, something of them had been stolen forever, for the memory of water rising, the knowledge that the swamp itself had nearly swallowed them, never left their minds. There were other punishments too, smaller but constant, each one chipping away at the spirit. Food withheld for days until stomachs cramped with hunger. Water fouled deliberately with filth before being ladled into bowls. Chains tightened until circulation faltered, leaving limbs numb, swollen, useless. Prisoners forced to kneel in the mud for hours, their bodies trembling until they collapsed forward, their faces pressed into the filth. Some were made to carry heavy stones on their backs for no reason other than the amusement of the guards, stumbling in circles until exhaustion dropped them to the ground. Others were dragged into the courtyards at night, stripped of their rags, and left exposed to the biting insects, their cries echoing into the darkness while the swamp itself fed upon them. And yet, perhaps the most terrifying punishment was not physical but psychological, the simple act of being chosen. The guards moved silently through the corridors, and when they stopped at a cell, when they unlocked chains and gestured without a word, the prisoner taken knew nothing of what awaited him. He might be returned hours later, bleeding and broken, or he might never return at all, his chain left empty, his fate swallowed by silence. The uncertainty was itself a torment, for every man knew that he could be chosen at any moment, that the guard's eyes might settle upon him, that the sound of keys at his door might signal the beginning of pain from which there was no escape. The anticipation of punishment, the constant dread of being singled out, was often worse than the punishment itself, for it filled the endless nights with terror, made every rattle of boots a reminder that suffering could be only moments away. There were whispers among the prisoners that the punishments were not merely acts of cruelty but entertainment, that the guards, hollow as they seemed, still found in these rituals a grim satisfaction. The silence of their faces never betrayed it, but some swore they saw faint smiles in the dim torchlight, flickers of amusement when a prisoner screamed, when a body collapsed, when madness took root in a man's eyes. Whether true or not, the belief itself deepened despair, for it meant that pain here was not an accident, not the indifferent work of the swamp, but the deliberate design of men who found purpose only in the breaking of others. And so, punishment in the swamp prison was not reserved for crime, nor for rebellion, nor even for disobedience. It was scattered like seeds, falling upon anyone, anywhere, for any reason, or for no reason at all. It was part of the daily rhythm, as inevitable as the rising mist, as constant as the dripping of water from the walls. Every prisoner bore its mark in scars across his back, in bruises across his limbs, in the hollow look of eyes that had seen too much. Punishment did not enforce order. Punishment was the order. It was the proof that men here were not meant to live with dignity, but to be broken, body and spirit alike, until they became nothing more than shadows chained to stone. Thus, the punishments of the swamp prison were as much a part of its design as the walls and the swamp itself. They ensured that no man could hold hope for long, that no spark of rebellion could survive, that even endurance was met with pain. Disease consumed the body, despair consumed the mind, but punishment consumed the soul, leaving behind only silence, only rot, only the knowledge that here, in this place, cruelty itself was the law, and that the swamp and the guards worked hand in hand to make certain no one returned alive. If punishment was a certainty within the prison's walls, then escape was the illusion that flickered briefly in the minds of the desperate, a faint flame that appeared only to be extinguished by the swamp itself, for the swamp prison was built not merely with walls of stone and gates of iron, but with the certainty that no man could leave, and yet, despite knowing this, despite the endless warnings carved into the scars of those who had tried before them, some prisoners still dared to dream of. Slipping past chains, past guards, past water and mist, into the freedom that lay somewhere far beyond. These dreams were rare, for despair weighed heavily on all, but hunger sharpened them, fever twisted them, punishment sometimes drove men to such reckless madness that the thought of drowning in the swamp seemed kinder than another day in chains. The first attempts, whispered of in the cells, were always clumsy, born of desperation rather than planning. A man would strike suddenly at a guard during labor, seizing a rod or a dull blade, swinging wildly before being cut down by others who stood silently ready. The swamp swallowed his body quickly, dragged out and left to sink beneath the mud as warning to those still breathing. Others tried to flee during the endless tasks, throwing themselves into the reeds when the guards' backs were turned, vanishing into the mist. Their cries were always heard minutes later, screams rising from the swamp as bodies were caught in quicksand or dragged beneath the surface by waters that clung tighter than chains. Sometimes the screams lasted long, carrying faintly across the mist into the night, and sometimes they ended abruptly, cut short as though swallowed whole. In either case, the men never returned, their places in the chains left empty, their names already forgotten. There were more elaborate escapes, too, for not every prisoner was broken quickly. Some watched carefully, studying the patterns of guards, the movements of lanterns in the towers, the opening and closing of gates. They whispered plans in the darkness, tracing them with trembling fingers into the mud, imagining paths through the reeds, imagining nights when the mist might conceal them. They saved scraps of bread, bits of cloth, shards of wood, weaving them together into crude tools or floats that might carry them across water. These plots grew in the minds of the hopeful, whispered so faintly that the sound was nearly lost beneath the dripping of water, and yet always the swamp seemed to know, as though it listened too, and always it was waiting. One tale, passed between prisoners like a secret prayer and curse alike, told of 3 men who had once managed to slip their chains in the labor yard. They had bribed a guard with the promise of riches hidden beyond the swamp, and whether the guard believed them or simply desired their silence forever, he had looked away for a single moment, long enough for them to vanish into the reeds. They were never seen again by the fortress, but days later, villagers on the far edge of the swamp spoke of hearing cries carried on the wind, of finding bones stripped clean by insects and animals, scattered in the mud miles apart from one another, as though the swamp itself had taken pleasure in tearing them into pieces before consuming the rest. Another story told of a man who tried to climb the walls themselves, his chains loosened by rust, his hands bloodied as he hauled himself upward, stone by slick stone. The guards did not strike him down, did not even raise their voices, for they knew the wall was slick with moss, knew it leaned outward in places, knew that no man could scale it without falling. And so they watched in silence as he climbed higher, his breath ragged, his arms trembling, until at last his grip slipped, and he plummeted into the mud below. His bones broke on the stone, his chains clattered against the wall, and the swamp's waters crept closer, pulling him downward until nothing remained but ripples fading into stillness. It was said, too, that some were driven to dig, scraping at the mud beneath their chains with their nails, with bits of stone, with fragments of wood stolen from labor. They dreamed of tunnels that might lead beneath the walls, beneath the moat, into freedom beyond. But the swamp laughed at such plans, for every tunnel filled with water, every passage collapsed before it reached more than a few paces, drowning the diggers in the very mud they had hoped would deliver them. When the guards found the sunken holes, they did not fill them, for they knew the swamp itself was the perfect warden, patient and merciless, never allowing a path where one was not meant to exist. Even those who had once lived near the swamp, men who knew its reeds, who had hunted its creatures or fished its waters, found no advantage here. For the swamp surrounding the fortress was not the swamp they had known, but something darker, something hungrier, a place where paths twisted back upon themselves, where mist made every tree, every pool, every patch of reeds identical. Men who thought themselves clever enough to navigate soon found themselves walking in circles, their footprints leading back to the walls from which they had fled, their despair complete as the guards dragged them once more through the gates, broken, bleeding, their punishment harsher than death. The greatest cruelty of failed escapes was not death itself, but the example it set. The guards left bodies where they fell whenever possible, sprawled across the mud of the yards, hanging half submerged in the swamp water, chained to posts as silent warnings. Days passed, and the bodies swelled, rotted, and sank, but the memory lingered, etched into the minds of those still chained. And so, escape became not a hope but a terror, for every whisper of freedom was answered by the image of drowned faces, broken bones, gnawed flesh. Men ceased even to speak of fleeing, their dreams of freedom silenced by the certainty that the swamp wanted them too much to let them go. The swamp prison was thus perfectly designed, not only by stone and iron but by nature itself, by the patience of water and mud, by the hunger of reeds and insects. It did not merely hold men, it consumed their will, ensuring that even thoughts of escape became another form of despair. And for those who still tried, for those whose desperation burned brighter than fear, the end was always the same. Silence, swallowed by water, absorbed into mist, forgotten by all but the swamp, which never released what it claimed. If the swamp prison broke men's bodies with hunger and disease, and if it crushed their hopes with failed escapes and endless punishments, then the final cruelty was the madness that crept quietly into their minds, spreading slowly, patiently, until it hollowed them out from within. Madness here was not sudden, not a flash of violence or frenzy, but a lingering shadow that fell across thoughts and dreams alike, darkening them until reality itself dissolved, until prisoners no longer knew whether they lived or dreamed, whether they were still men or merely phantoms wandering the damp corridors of despair. It began subtly, so subtly that at first it seemed nothing at all, just a prisoner whispering to himself in the darkness, or staring too long at the dripping walls, or laughing quietly at nothing. But in the swamp fortress, where time had no shape, where days and nights blended into one another without rhythm or end, those small cracks widened quickly, until the mind itself became another cell, another prison from which there could be no escape. The endless dripping of water was often the first thing to unravel a man's thoughts. It never stopped, never paused, each drop echoing in the silence like a clock without hands, marking time without meaning. Prisoners lay awake at night, their eyes open to the darkness, listening to that drip, 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 until it became all they could hear, until it filled their heads, until it seemed to seep into their veins, their hearts beating in rhythm with it, their minds drowning in its endless monotony. Some tried to block it out by humming or muttering, but the guards punished noise, and so most learned to suffer in silence, their thoughts consumed by the sound, until they muttered only to themselves, lips moving silently, words spoken to no one but the dripping water. Then came the voices. At first, prisoners mistook them for dreams, faint whispers that drifted in through the misty cracks of the walls, calling their names, speaking in tones long familiar. Wives, mothers, children, friends. Some swore they heard laughter, warm and gentle, others the soothing tones of lullabies once sung in childhood. But the more they listened, the more the voices shifted, twisting into cries, into screams, into mocking laughter that filled the darkness. Men began to answer these voices, speaking aloud in their chains, begging forgiveness from those who were not there, confessing sins to shadows, pleading for mercy to walls that gave none. Their companions, chained beside them, heard only whispers and sobs, and they turned their faces away, for they knew that madness, once begun, spread quickly, like mold in the dampness, infecting those who listened too closely. Dreams, too, became twisted in the swamp prison. Hunger turned them to visions of food, feasts of roasted meat, baskets of bread, pitchers of clear water, but each time a man reached for them, the food turned to filth, the bread crawling with worms, the water thick with slime, the meat rotting in his hands. He would wake with his stomach cramping, the taste of decay still in his mouth, only to find the damp floor beneath him, the chains upon his wrists, the endless darkness pressing down once more. Others dreamed of freedom, of walking across open fields, of breathing fresh air beneath a clear sky, of seeing loved ones waiting with open arms. But just as he drew near, just as he reached for them, the swamp rose from the ground, swallowing the earth, pulling him back into the mire. He would wake screaming, his cries echoing off the stone, his companions turning away, for they too had dreamed the same dream, and they knew how it ended. Madness showed itself in other ways too. Some prisoners stopped speaking altogether, retreating so deeply into themselves that no word could be coaxed from their lips. They sat in silence, staring blankly at the walls, their eyes wide and glassy, their bodies still except for the trembling of breath. They no longer ate when food was placed before them, no longer moved when struck, no longer cried when punished. It was as though the swamp had already claimed them, though their hearts still beat. Others grew frantic, their despair boiling over into sudden bursts of violence. They clawed at their chains, tearing skin from their wrists, biting at the iron until their teeth cracked, throwing themselves against the walls until their bones broke. Their screams were wild, unending, filled not with words but with raw sound, the language of men who no longer remembered speech. The guards watched these displays with the same silence they gave all else. They did not intervene unless the violence threatened their own order, and even then, their response was not to comfort but to restrain, to beat, to chain more tightly. Madness was no crime in the swamp prison. It was expected, it was inevitable, it was part of the design. The fortress did not merely tolerate it, but fostered it, knowing that broken minds made broken bodies easier to control. A madman might scream, he might rave, but he would not plan, he would not resist, he would not escape. In this way, madness was another chain, invisible but stronger than iron, binding men more tightly than any lock. The prisoners themselves came to fear madness more than death. Death was final, silent, an end to pain, but madness was endless, a torment that consumed while the body still lived. To watch a companion sink into it was to watch a mirror of one's own future, for no man was immune, no matter how strong, no matter how silent. Hunger gnawed at the stomach, dampness rotted the flesh, punishment scarred the skin, but madness ate the mind, the very last refuge a man had, and once it was gone, there was nothing left. The swamp whispered constantly, pressing against the walls, and in time, all minds yielded. Some prisoners clung to rituals to resist it. They counted their breaths, traced patterns into the mud with their fingers, whispered prayers again and again, the same words repeated endlessly like charms against the darkness. They clung to memories, reciting the names of loved ones, describing fields and rivers, listing the days of the week, though there was no week to measure. For some, these rituals held madness at bay a little longer, a fragile wall against the flood. But eventually, even the strongest faltered, their prayers forgotten, their memories fading, their words dissolving into silence. Madness did not strike like a storm, but seeped like water, wearing down stone, drop by drop, until nothing remained. And so the swamp prison did not merely hold bodies, did not merely starve and punish. It dissolved the mind itself, turning men into shells long before their hearts ceased to beat. The madness within was not an accident, not a failure of care, but a deliberate cruelty, born of dampness, silence, hunger, punishment, and the endless night. It was the final assurance that no man would ever return whole, that even if by some miracle he escaped the chains and the swamp, he would leave behind his reason, wandering broken through the world beyond, carrying forever the whispers of water, the echo of chains, the shadows of a prison that consumed not only life but the very soul. If madness consumed the mind inside the walls, then forgetfulness consumed the men outside. For perhaps the cruelest punishment of the swamp prison was not only that no one returned, but that, in time, it was as though no one had ever gone at all. The prison did not merely chain the body or rot the spirit. It erased names, erased histories, erased the threads that bound a man to family and to village, until those who had been dragged into the mist ceased to exist even in memory, their lives dissolving as completely as their bones in the swamp. For the fortress was never written of in records, never spoken of in proclamations, never acknowledged in the ledgers of kings. It existed in silence, a shadow on the edge of maps, and those who entered its gates entered a silence just as deep, one that spread outward until it reached the world beyond, until even loved ones found themselves muttering less and less, until even the most cherished names grew too heavy to carry. In the villages and towns from which the prisoners had once been taken, the absence was felt at first like a wound. Mothers wept in doorways, wives searched the empty horizon, children asked again and again when their fathers would return. Neighbors whispered at markets, speculating, their voices low, for fear of being heard by the wrong ears. For a time, prayers were offered, candles burned, messages sent in vain. But the prison was relentless, and silence was its greatest weapon. No letters came back, no bodies were returned, no grave markers given. Days turned to months, months to years, and as time stretched on, grief hardened into quiet acceptance, until names were spoken less often, until questions stopped being asked. The prisoners had been taken not only from life, but from remembrance, their absence sealed as tightly as the gates that had swallowed them. Some families clung to memory longer than others. Wives recited their husbands' names each night, whispering them into the darkness as though repetition might keep them alive. Children grew up repeating stories they scarcely remembered, convinced that speaking their fathers' names would bring them back. But memory is fragile in a world that demands survival, and hunger and labor and fear soon pressed more heavily than remembrance. A boy grew into a man without the face of his father. A woman aged into widowhood without ever knowing for certain if she was one. The name faded from lips, from songs, from records, until it lived only in the prison itself, echoing faintly against the damp stone as if mocking the silence beyond. Inside the fortress, the forgetting was faster, for the swamp consumed names as greedily as it consumed flesh. Prisoners arrived with identities still clinging faintly to them, shouting their names when chains first closed around their wrists, calling out in despair for their families as the gates swallowed them. But soon, those names were stripped away. The guards never used them, for they did not need to. To the guards, men were numbers at best, bodies at worst, shadows chained to stone with no individuality worth noting. Even their punishments were delivered in silence, with no words to mark one prisoner apart from another. Among the prisoners themselves, names lingered only briefly, traded in whispers as introductions in the first weeks, but as disease and despair thinned their ranks, those names were forgotten too, replaced by coughs, by faces pale in the torchlight, by the endless rattle of chains. There were stories of men who, in their madness, forgot their own names, who sat muttering not in memory but in confusion, struggling to recall the syllables that had once belonged to them. They pressed their faces against the damp walls, repeating fragments of sounds like prayers, until even those fragments dissolved, and they became nameless even to themselves. Others clung stubbornly, shouting their names again and again until their voices cracked, until the guards silenced them with rods, until their throats bled from the effort. But shouting could not save them. Their voices carried only into the swamp, and the swamp was a place that kept nothing but silence. The forgotten names lingered only in the prison stones, if they lingered anywhere at all. Some said that when the mist was thickest, when the torches guttered low, faint whispers could be heard rising from the walls, syllables broken, fragments of names that no one could quite make out. The guards ignored them, or perhaps they pretended to, for they too had heard the whispers when their shifts dragged on too long, and the sound followed them into their sleep. The prisoners listened with hollow eyes, unsure whether the whispers came from the walls or from their own minds. But either way, it was a cruel reminder. Names had lived once, they had echoed once, but here they had no place. Here they dissolved as completely as the bodies that sank into the swamp. And beyond the swamp, in the world of fields and villages and hearths, life went on. Crops were sown, children born, houses built and abandoned again. The missing were not mourned forever, for mourning has its limits when survival demands labor and hunger demands food. Eventually, the empty chairs were filled by others, the fields tended by other hands, the laughter at feasts belonging to other voices. The forgotten names did not echo there. They vanished entirely, as though the men had never lived, as though the prison had swallowed not only their lives, but the very memory of their existence. Thus, the swamp fortress achieved what no ordinary gallows, no battlefield, no famine ever could. Death leaves graves, battles leave scars, famines leave stories. But the swamp prison left nothing. No grave for a mother to kneel beside. No scar in the land to remind men of suffering. No song or tale to keep names alive. It left only silence, only absence, only the certainty that once a man entered those gates, he was gone not only from the world of the living, but from the world of memory. His name, once spoken with love or anger or pride, was swallowed whole, leaving behind only emptiness. And in this way, the swamp prison was more complete than any other instrument of punishment or cruelty. For death alone cannot erase. It leaves traces, it leaves whispers, it leaves remembrance. But forgetting is deeper, heavier, more final. In forgetting, a man is not only dead but undone, as though he never existed, as though the swamp had not merely claimed his life, but erased the very fact of it. This was the true cruelty of the fortress, the shadow heavier than chains or dampness, the certainty that here all names were forgotten, all voices silenced, all lives erased so completely that not even memory dared to resist. Death in the swamp prison did not arrive with the sharpness of a sword or the finality of a gallows, nor did it come with trumpets, proclamations, or rituals of farewell. It came instead as silence, slow and heavy, creeping into the damp corridors just as the mist crept through the swamp reeds, patient, inexorable, and inevitable. Death here was never sudden, except for those rare few who were struck down in punishment or who slipped into the swamp during a failed escape. For most, it arrived gradually, a companion that sat beside them in their chains, whispering in their ears for weeks, sometimes months, before finally claiming them. And when it did, there was no ceremony, no recognition, no grave, only silence, deeper than the silence that already filled the fortress, swallowing even the faint whispers of identity that still lingered. The process began long before the last breath. The body wasted first, flesh shrinking from bones, muscles trembling with every movement until even lifting a crust of bread became an effort. Faces grew hollow, eyes sinking back into their sockets, the skin stretched taut and pale, damp with fever sweat or clammy with the cold of damp stone. The cough came next, deep and rattling, filling the corridors with its echoes, each spasm leaving the chest weaker, the throat raw. Wounds that had once been small grew into open sores, festering endlessly, crawling with flies, oozing with the damp corruption of the swamp. Some lingered in this state for weeks, their bodies breaking slowly, their spirits already gone, while others succumbed more quickly, surrendering to fever or infection or the simple exhaustion of labor. The prisoners learned to recognize the signs. They watched their companions weaken, saw the trembling hands, the eyes that no longer focused, the chains that rattled less and less as movement dwindled. They did not speak of it, for speaking names had long since become dangerous, but they knew. And when the moment came, when the prisoner slumped against the wall and did not rise, when his breath slowed and then stopped altogether, they felt no surprise. Death was no stranger here. It was an expectation, a routine, part of the prison as surely as the damp walls and the buzzing flies. Yet each time, it left behind a silence that was heavier than before, a silence that pressed upon the survivors, reminding them that their own time would come soon enough. The guards treated death with the same indifference they gave to life. When a man died, they came with no haste, sometimes hours, sometimes days later, to unfasten the chains from his limp body. They did not close his eyes, did not straighten his limbs, did not murmur a word. They dragged the corpse by its wrists or ankles through the corridors, the head striking the stone, the chains rattling faintly as if the body still moved. Sometimes the dead were carried out into the swamp, thrown into the black water where insects and creatures of the mire devoured them. Other times they were left in shallow pits of mud, half submerged until the swamp swallowed them whole. There were no graves, no markers, no ashes. The swamp was the only graveyard, the reeds the only mourners, the mist the only shroud. The silence of death spread quickly among the prisoners. When a companion was taken, the chains left behind rattled emptily, the absence louder than any scream. Men averted their eyes, unwilling to watch too long, for each death was a mirror of their own. Some muttered prayers, soft and desperate, but most said nothing, for they knew the swamp cared little for prayer. The silence of death was contagious, seeping into every cell, reminding each man that he too would be dragged out one day, nameless, unmarked, unremembered. The silence did not terrify so much as it suffocated, wrapping around the survivors like chains, making them move more slowly, speak more softly, breathe more carefully, as though trying to delay the inevitable. There were no funerals, no songs, no moments of remembrance. Death came and went as quietly as the mist, leaving behind nothing but emptiness. Even the guards' boots striking against the stone seemed louder after a death, their silence more cutting, their indifference more complete. The prison itself seemed to absorb the lives it claimed, the walls growing heavier with each death, the stones darker, the dampness thicker. Some prisoners swore that the fortress remembered, that the whispers they heard in the night were the voices of the dead, calling faintly from within the walls, trying to remind the living that they had once existed. But even if this were true, the swamp ensured that those whispers never reached beyond the gates, never carried into the world outside. The cruelest part of the silence of death was not the end itself, but the erasure that followed. Within days, the dead were forgotten, their names already faded, their faces blurred in memory. The men who had labored beside them, who had whispered with them in the darkness, who had shared scraps of bread or fragments of hope, soon ceased to speak of them at all. Survival demanded it, for to cling to memory in a place of forgetting was to invite despair. And so, each death added another layer of silence, not only in the corridors of the prison, but in the minds of those who remained. The swamp had not only claimed the body, but stolen remembrance, leaving behind nothing. The silence of death was not cruel in its violence, but in its indifference. It did not roar, it did not cry out, it did not mark itself with spectacle. It simply came, again and again, stripping away one prisoner at a time until the fortress echoed less with moans and coughs and more with emptiness. And in that emptiness lay the true horror, for men realized that their lives had not ended in defiance, had not even ended in punishment, but had ended in nothingness, erased so completely that the world would never know. And so the swamp prison remained a place of silence, a silence that did not end with death but deepened with it, spreading like mist through every stone and reed, until it seemed that the entire fortress was built not of stone and iron but of silence itself, the silence of forgotten names, of broken minds, of empty chains, of lives ended without witness, without memory, without sound. Beyond the walls, far from the swamp's heavy mist and the fortress's dripping stones, life carried on in the villages, towns, and scattered farms that dotted the land. But even there the shadow of the prison was felt, though never seen directly. For while no man who entered ever returned, and while the swamp claimed every body and every name, stories found their way outward, seeping into the world like the damp that seeped through the stones. These stories grew into legends, whispered at firesides, muttered in taverns, passed in low voices from traveler to traveler, never spoken loudly, never claimed as truth, but always lingering, shaping the fears and imaginations of those who lived beyond the swamp. In this way, though the prison erased its victims within, it haunted the world without, not with facts, but with the weight of rumor, with the power of legend. The first of these legends spoke of the swamp itself. Mothers warned their children never to wander too near its edge, for the waters were said to be bottomless, ready to swallow any who strayed too far. Farmers claimed to hear voices drifting from the mist on still nights, soft cries, sometimes laughter, sometimes screams, carried across the reeds, though none dared investigate. Some said these voices were the souls of prisoners, calling for help, forever trapped within the swamp. Others believed they were the swamp's own lure, a trick to draw the curious closer, so that the mud could claim them as it claimed all things. Whatever the truth, few dared approach the swamp's borders, and those who did returned quickly, pale and silent, unwilling to speak of what they had heard. Other legends focused on the fortress itself, though most villagers had never seen its walls. They spoke of a black tower rising from the mist, taller than any church steeple, its windows glowing faintly at night with lights that could not be torches. Some claimed the fortress was not built by men at all, but had risen from the swamp like a growth of stone, a natural curse given form. Others insisted it had been constructed by kings long dead, men who wished to hide their enemies not merely from sight but from history itself. Still others whispered darker tales, saying the prison was not truly a prison but a temple, a place where the suffering of men was offered as sacrifice to the swamp, which in return guarded the land from some older, deeper terror hidden beneath the reeds. These tales changed with every telling, shifting like mist, but they all carried the same certainty. The fortress was not a place of justice, nor of mercy, but of doom. Travelers who passed near the swamp often added to the stories. Some spoke of strange lights moving across the water at night, pale glows like lanterns, though no man carried them. Others claimed to have seen figures in the mist, gaunt, hollow-eyed shapes that vanished when approached, leaving only ripples in the mud. Merchants swore that their horses balked and reared when the road turned too near the swamp, refusing to step forward until driven with whips, their eyes rolling with terror. Pilgrims told of dreams that haunted them after resting near the swamp's edge, dreams of chains rattling in darkness, of dripping water, of whispers calling their names. These travelers spread their stories to distant towns, and so the prison's legend grew far beyond the land it haunted, until even those who had never seen the swamp spoke of it with shivers. In the villages closest to the swamp, the legends were darker still, for these people lived with the constant weight of its presence. They told their children that to misbehave was to risk being taken by the guards who came at night, silent as shadows, dragging the disobedient away to the fortress. Fireside tales described men who had once vanished in the mist only to return years later as ghosts, their chains rattling faintly, their eyes empty hollows, their voices gone. Festivals avoided the swamp's direction, as though to look upon it was to invite misfortune. And when the mist drifted farther than usual, curling into streets and fields, villagers bolted their doors and whispered prayers, convinced that the swamp was reaching outward, searching for more souls to claim. There were also those who swore the swamp had cursed the land beyond its borders. Illnesses that struck suddenly in nearby farms were blamed on the breath of the swamp. Crops that rotted in the field, animals that wasted away without cause, storms that flooded the lowlands, all were said to be the swamp prison's reach, punishment for some forgotten sin or perhaps simply the spreading of its hunger. Priests tried to offer explanations, speaking of natural causes, but even they avoided the swamp, their words trembling, their sermons avoiding the subject. In their silence, villagers found confirmation of what they already believed, that the swamp and the fortress were not natural but supernatural, not punishment for crime but punishment for being alive too near its shadow. Over time, the prison became more than a place. It became a symbol, a story told to frightened children, a warning whispered to travelers, a shadow that stretched across generations. Some claimed it was not a real place at all, that it existed only in stories, a myth born from fear of the swamp. Yet even those who doubted did not dare to test the truth. No one willingly entered the swamp, no one searched for the fortress, no one followed the voices in the mist. For whether it was real or not, the fear it inspired was real enough, heavy and inescapable, binding as tightly as any chain. And so, outside the swamp, the legends grew and spread, carried by whispers, shaped by fear, fed by silence. The prison erased its victims within, stripping them of names, of identity, of existence, but beyond its walls, it lingered in imagination, in stories that never died. In this way, the swamp prison achieved a paradox both cruel and complete. Inside, men were forgotten as though they had never lived, while outside, the prison itself was remembered as though it had always existed, eternal, unchanging, inevitable. It became less a place than a presence, less a fortress than a shadow, and in time, even those who had never heard its true history knew enough to fear it, to avoid it, to whisper of it only in the lowest of tones. Thus, the legends outside ensured that the swamp prison silence was never truly silent. For though no cry ever escaped its walls, the world beyond carried its echo, reshaping it into stories, warnings, and nightmares that endured long after the prisoners themselves had been erased. The fortress swallowed names, but in return it gave birth to legends, and these legends spread farther than any chain, ensuring that while no man returned alive, the prison itself would never be forgotten. Every fortress, no matter how strong its stones or how cruel its design, carries within it the seeds of its own decline, and so too did the swamp prison, though its fall was not sudden, nor marked by fire and siege as so many fortresses elsewhere were, but instead came slowly, as patiently as the swamp itself, a long decay that stretched across generations, until the prison became not only a place of torment but of ruin. Its silence deepened, its chains rusted, its walls sinking slowly into the mire. At first, there was no sign of weakness, for the fortress seemed as eternal as the swamp that fed it, each reinforcing the other, each ensuring that no man who entered would ever return. But stone, like flesh, cannot resist time forever, and the same dampness that rotted prisoners' bodies began also to eat at the walls that confined them. The first signs were small, almost invisible. Moss thickened upon the stones, roots crept into cracks, water pooled more heavily at the base of towers. The guards patched where they could, replacing beams, shoring up crumbling corners, but the swamp always returned, undoing their efforts with every season. Foundations shifted as the mire beneath swallowed stones whole, walls bowed outward, walkways sagged and collapsed into the water. What had once been a fortress of grim endurance began to look instead like a carcass half consumed, its strength corroded not by men but by the land itself. Yet the prison continued its work, swallowing new prisoners, erasing new names, as though the ruin itself were part of its design, as though its very collapse was simply another method of cruelty. The guards, too, dwindled. For centuries, they had endured the same damp air, the same fevers and rashes that tormented the prisoners, though they had the privilege of leaving when their duty ended. But fewer and fewer returned whole, and whispers spread through the villages that service in the swamp fortress was not an assignment but a sentence in itself. Men dreaded being chosen to serve there, and some vanished into the countryside rather than march into the mist. Families resisted the duty, bribed officials, begged priests, anything to avoid losing their sons to the swamp. As the years passed, fewer guards arrived to replace those who succumbed, and the fortress grew quieter, its watchtowers less manned, its corridors patrolled by fewer boots. Silence deepened not only in the cells but in the halls above, until the prison seemed less like a place run by men and more like one abandoned to the swamp. With fewer guards came neglect. The punishments grew less frequent, not out of mercy but out of weariness. The work of despair dwindled, the labor yards half submerged, the stones left unmoved, the reeds left uncut. Prisoners no longer marched in long chains into the swamp, but instead rotted in their cells, left to their own silence, their own madness. Food became scarcer still, sometimes forgotten altogether, for there were fewer hands to carry buckets, fewer men to watch over the feeding. Disease spread more freely, bodies piled in corners of corridors before being dragged out days later. The swamp fed less by ritual drowning and more by neglect. The prison, once efficient in its cruelty, became careless, its indifference deepening into abandonment, and this, too, was another kind of torment, for prisoners were left to waste not under the deliberate blows of guards, but under the slower blows of hunger, sickness, and isolation. Legends outside grew stronger in these years, for travelers spoke less often of lights in the towers and more of silence, of structures half collapsed, of gates that hung open without movement. They told of reeds growing where courtyards had once been, of trees sprouting in the cracks of walls, of water flooding chambers that had once held men. Some claimed to see no guards at all, only empty towers and silent gates, and yet they swore they heard chains rattling in the mist, voices muttering from within the walls, as though the prisoners remained even without their jailers, as though the swamp itself had taken over the task. In taverns, it was said that the swamp prison no longer belonged to men but to the dead, that it had become less a fortress than a tomb, haunted by those who had been forgotten, their whispers stronger now that no human voices remained to cover them. Inside, those prisoners who still survived felt the decline in every stone. Cells collapsed as the swamp devoured them, ceilings dripping so heavily that pools turned into floods, chains rusting until they snapped, leaving men unbound yet still trapped by the swamp outside. Some wandered through half-abandoned corridors, their minds too broken to recognize freedom, their bodies too weak to escape. They stumbled into collapsed towers, into flooded chambers, into yards overrun with reeds, and there they lingered, shadows among ruins, half men, half ghosts. The guards, fewer in number and weaker in spirit, made no effort to stop them, for they knew the swamp itself would hold them, that no matter how far they wandered, there was no escape. The decline was not sudden, nor was it complete. For decades, the prison remained half alive, half dead, a place where men still suffered, but where the structures around them sank deeper and deeper into ruin. The towers leaned farther with each year, their stones sliding into the mud. The gates rusted so thoroughly that they no longer closed properly, their iron bars corroded into jagged fragments. Bridges across the moats collapsed, leaving gaps that no one bothered to repair. The fortress that had once been designed to hold men forever was itself being held by the swamp, consumed as surely as its prisoners had been, absorbed into the mire from which it had risen. And yet, despite its ruin, its legend grew stronger. The villagers who once feared the guards now feared the silence more. They whispered that no living man kept watch any more, that the swamp itself had taken command, that the ghosts of prisoners chained in death had become the true wardens. Some said the decline was not decline at all, but transformation, that the prison had shed its outer shell of stone and iron to become something more eternal, more dreadful. And so they avoided the swamp even more fiercely than before, convinced that what lay within was no longer a fortress, but a graveyard alive with whispers, a place where the dead themselves watched, waiting, remembering. In this way, the decline of the swamp prison was no mercy, no release, but another cruelty, for it ensured that those who remained alive within were not only imprisoned by chains, but abandoned in ruins, left to starve in silence, left to wander corridors collapsing around them, left to rot in a fortress that was itself dying. And yet the swamp cared little, for it was patient, and it would take not only the prisoners but the walls, the gates, the towers, until nothing remained above the water, until all was swallowed and silent, as it had always intended. In the end, when years had stretched into decades and decades into centuries, the swamp proved itself the truest master of the fortress, for while men had built the walls, while guards had once patrolled the towers, while prisoners had filled the cells with their moans and chains, all these were temporary, fragile things, and the swamp was eternal. Slowly, patiently, without haste, it crept into every crack, every stone, every chamber, until at last the fortress was no longer a place apart from the swamp, but a part of it, consumed as thoroughly as the men who had perished within. Towers that had once loomed darkly above the mist now leaned drunkenly into the mire, their stones crumbling, their outlines softened by moss and reeds. Gates that had once shrieked open with iron strength now sagged into rust, their bars eaten away, their hinges lost beneath layers of rot. Causeways collapsed into the black water, swallowed whole, until no path remained to reach the fortress but the swamp itself, thick and churning, ready to pull down any who dared approach. The cells that had once held endless misery fell in upon themselves, ceilings dripping until the weight of water broke them, walls bowing outward until the swamp poured in, drowning chains and corpses alike in black pools. The labor yards became indistinguishable from the swamp beyond, reeds sprouting where stones had once been dragged, frogs and snakes claiming the mud where men had once stumbled in endless circles of despair. Rats, once parasites in the prison, became its rulers, scurrying freely through abandoned corridors, gnawing on bones that no longer bore chains. Even the watchtowers, those squat structures where guards had once stood in silent vigil, collapsed into the water, their timbers sinking slowly, until only stumps of wood jutted upward, blackened, half submerged, like rotten teeth in a drowning mouth. The guards themselves vanished long before the final ruin. Some left willingly, abandoning their posts when the fortress no longer provided even the semblance of order. Others were claimed by the same sickness and madness as the prisoners, their bodies left to rot in the same mud, their bones indistinguishable from those they had once commanded. In the end, there were no wardens, no overseers, no chains rattled by human hands. The prison lived only in the silence of what it had been, a carcass picked clean by the swamp, a ruin hidden so deeply in mist that travelers doubted whether it had ever truly existed. And yet, though the fortress died, the swamp remembered. For the swamp does not forget, even when men do. It held within its depths the rusted links of chains, the bones of the nameless, the whispers of madness that had once echoed in damp corridors. On still nights, when the mist lay heavy and the frogs croaked in mournful rhythm, some swore they could hear faint rattles beneath the water, as though the swamp itself shook with the memories of chains. Others spoke of voices drifting across the reeds, voices that called out not in language but in sorrow, the remnants of men whose names had been erased from the world, yet whose despair lingered in the land itself. Whether truth or imagination, none dared to test it, for the swamp that had once consumed a fortress was now left unchallenged, and no man wished to join the countless who had been swallowed before. Outside, the legends endured even as the fortress itself disappeared beneath mud and water. Villagers spoke of the cursed place that had once stood within the swamp, though none could point to its exact location, for the land had shifted, the reeds grown thick, the waters risen high. Some claimed that the fortress had sunk entirely, dragged beneath the swamp as a final offering, its stones buried in silt, its gates rusting in the depths. Others said it still stood, hidden in mist, waiting for the foolish to wander too close, its cells still filled with shadows, its chains still cold to the touch. But whether swallowed completely or hidden by time, the truth mattered little, for the swamp remained, and the swamp itself was enough to carry the prison's memory. In this way, the swamp reclaimed all, prisoners, guards, walls, chains, names, and silence. It left nothing behind but legend, nothing but whispers, nothing but the certainty that here had been a place of such cruelty that it could not endure, and yet of such weight that it could never be forgotten. The swamp had erased the fortress as surely as the fortress had erased the names of its prisoners, And in this double erasure lay the final cruelty, that both the suffering and the structure built to contain it had vanished, leaving only stories, only fear, only shadows in the mist. And perhaps this was fitting. For a place that had lived by silence, that had thrived on forgetting, that had existed to consume without witness, its end too was silence, its ruin too was forgetting. No stone memorial marked its fall, no chronicle recorded its last prisoner, no song lamented its final death. The swamp reclaimed it as it had reclaimed every man who had passed through its gates, holding it deep in its damp embrace, never to release it again. And so, tonight, as you lie in the stillness of your own room, far from the swamp, far from its dampness and its silence, you may allow yourself to remember what those prisoners could not, to carry for a moment the weight of their story, and then to let it fade, as all things fade into the quiet of night. The swamp reclaims all, and in its patience, it reminds us that nothing built by men endures forever. The fortress is gone, its chains rusted, its stones swallowed, its voices silenced. All that remains is mist, water, and legend. And now, let that legend fade too. Allow your eyes to grow heavy, your breath to slow, your body to sink into the comfort of your bed. Let the swamp remain far away, its whispers lost in the distance, while you drift gently into sleep. For the story is finished, the prison is gone, and the night, endless and calm, now belongs to you.